This is sort of trying to give this to my financial person.
It's correct.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's just finding it.
You could write it about the.
Yeah, we would comment upon that. And also, you know, remember, the other thing you can always do is HUD's got that ask a question feature. It's something to use. I mean,
It only takes 2 months to get an answer.
if you're lucky. I mean, sometimes it's a really hard question they never answer. I mean, I asked them a question like 3 years ago. It comes up because, you know, COC boards, right? What are they? You know, we've got a board here, and in most cases, they're not a legal entity whatsoever. So what happens? They're making financial decisions. I mean, you know, so that was the question. You know, what is the legal liability of these COC boards? Because I mean, somebody can sue you, right? I mean, you're on the COC board, and you know, we decided not to fund XYZ agency. You know, this is a litigious society. Suppose that XYZ agency sues you for whatever reason whatsoever, and then you're board. You know, there could be some liability there. Well, so that was the question to HUD. What is, you know, is there any liability? Is there any protection for COC boards? Nothing for months. Then I got a response saying, we've had to refer that to HUD, question back to HUD. It's a difficult question. It just never, ever responded to that issue. Sometimes they don't respond.
I have like a 7-month line.
It's really complex. However, some things are easier than others, and they have stock replies on it. It is a useful thing, because clearly if you got a query like that, and if you get HUD ask a question to say, no, in that instance you can charge that damage thing, put it in your file and charge away, you know, and your tushy's covered, basically. But if you don't have that tushy cover, be careful, because you know they can come in there and say you're charging fees to program participants. So it is risky. We were talking about terminate. Do you think they've come?
Yeah, they're not down there.
Oh, okay. I'm going to say 2 more things, and then we're going to break for lunch. So remember, there should be program rules that people should know up front, because they know when they're violating it. You can't, if you're going to terminate anybody from your program, you must give them written notification that they're being terminated. You've got to do this in writing. You've got to tell them specifically what it is that they've done. That is the reason for being terminated. And on top of that, you have got to give them the opportunity to appeal that decision. As you know, whenever you have an appeal, certainly within in the government context, that appeal has got to be made to somebody who has the authority to reverse the decision that was made negatively to the person. So basically, you know, if I make the decision to terminate somebody from the program, the appeal does not come to me. The appeal goes to my boss. And if I'm the executive director of the agency, the appeal has got to go to somebody in the board of directors who can overrule my decision in case it's wrong. That's the basic thing. And then finally, you know, once you've gone through that appeal process, you also in writing have to provide a written response to the participant as to why it is that we've heard their appeal, but we're still going to terminate them from the program. Whenever you do these things, remember, we're going to talk a little bit about reasonable accommodations, but you know, whenever you're terminating, you've got to pay attention to, is this somewhat related to the person's underlying disability, and is there a way we can address their disability without having to terminate them from the program? But more importantly is we will all have some form of disability if we starve. And so therefore, why don't we take a break to unstarve? We're coming back, wanted to highlight a couple of things. First of all, you know, we started out, we should have really celebrated more, because we did have such a highly successful NOFA in 2017. So everybody, you all did. By the way, we're successful because you all do amazing work. That's why we were successful. But, you know, HUD even saw that and said, yay. And they never go away, do they? So this, as Jim was saying yesterday, this goes from points of acute crisis to steady state crisis, I think. So we're sort of in the steady state crisis now, but we know an acute crisis is not a way to future. What we're going to want to do this year, with hope springs eternal, is to maybe get a little ahead of this process. So you're going to see in the near term, remember we do this evaluation of the renewal grants. You know, we're going to in the near future be presenting to the board some revised scoring things for the renewal stuff. This is of course important to everybody, and nothing is imposed on people from above. So it's really important as these are developed that are going to take a look at that, see what makes sense. Provide feedback. If it doesn't make sense, give us the feedback. We want this to be an evaluation mechanism that everybody respects as being as meaningful and as something you can buy into, as really representing what we all agree is are programs that are really successfully doing. We want to be able to show those programs that are highly successful. And we also, if there are really poor performers, HUD wants us to do that. We want to identify the ones that are really not achieving what it is that we want to achieve. And we want to either improve those programs or we want to reallocate those funds to make sure that it is effective. Overwhelmingly, we are hugely effective. We're required to do that, so those criteria are going to be coming out soon. Pay attention to that, give us feedback, make sure that you can accept this process of evaluation and it makes sense to you to be evaluated on this.
Yeah, just a couple of quick things. So kind of translated into English. The internal competition, we're going to step it up a little bit. We'll probably have that in the spring, so look for that from anytime from like March through April. But to what Howard was saying, if all kidding aside, we do want your input. If the evaluation criteria doesn't make sense, then please let us know and we'll revise that, or we'll at least take it under advisement and try to figure out how to maybe communicate that differently. And so that's one thing. One thing I did want to mention, this is totally off topic, but we've had a couple people approach us about doing a statewide conference for housing. And I know this is kind of a weird way of asking, but I kind of would like to get a sense of if anybody would be interested in going to a statewide housing conference where we would have special speakers and a special, maybe multiple special tracks training-wise. I think we used to do this like years ago, well before my time, but I just want to get a sense of whether you all would be interested in something like this. If so, could you just throw up your hand? Okay, great. The next question, kind of along those lines, is just, and if you want to, you can just email me this, but I'd kind of like to get a sense of if you would be willing to contribute something towards that in order to, Jennifer.
I'm sorry, yes, I jumped with that. Yes, so years ago, we used to do it when it was itchy. I don't know how many of you were like old timers, but, and so they had a housing conference that we didn't really have to pay for. Once we kind of combined with the IHCDA housing conference, that's when it became like $350 for 2 days of talking about housing development. And it wasn't geared towards really what we do here. So I love the idea of bringing that, but it would have to be affordable because I want my whole staff to go. Right. Like I don't need to be the one going all the time.
Right, and that's exactly what we want to make it affordable, but we need a little sense of what does that mean? Is that $100? Is that $50? What could, what's a reasonable amount that we can charge? It's not so much, we can underwrite a lot of it, but there are costs that we really have to look to you to help us pay for the food, for example, because food is expensive, unfortunately. So that's where we really need some contributions to pay for that kind of thing. So just want to get a sense of if you want to email me, you can, or you want to tell me later how much you'd be willing to what kind of a price you would pay for a conference. That would be helpful. And then the last thing is just kind of getting a sense of like a time frame. We talked about doing this possibly in August this year or October. So does anybody have any preferences if we end up doing this? Okay, sounds good to me.
Sorry to hog, but before we move on, for the internal competition, like the changes and scoring criteria, do you have any thoughts on what that could look like, or any back to Howard?
Sure, but again, this is really for discussion. And looking at the same things. Now, obviously, we want to pay attention to the kind of stuff that Kevin pays attention to. So we are going to pay, of course, attention to, again, placement in permanent housing or retention in permanent housing, because that's the goal here. Obviously, we're going to look for income. We're going to look for earned income, of course, because those are the things that HUD is looking for there. We're going to look at returns to homelessness, because that's another of their factors. We're going to, one of the things that we want to look at is some way to measure something around coordinated entry. Like in Nebraska, we did a thing that all we said is, okay, it's a requirement that you do a BoSCoC on everybody that you took into the program. And if we can have documentation that you had, if you had 100% of your folks who were brought into your program, had a DI spit out done with them, that's great. That's a good symbol that we've had some level of participation in coordinating. So we'll try and get something like that shows the participation in coordinated entry. I'd like to, on the housing first becomes important. We have points in there. What we've done in the past is if you clicked on the application that you are housing first, folks got points. There are some COCs, Miami developed this, Denver's using it, that instead of doing that, HUD did this housing first self-assessment thing, you know, like everything that HUD does goes on for like about 50 pages. It goes to levels of detail that like are great, but are like overwhelming. So I want to like step back from that and rather than just go yes, no on housing first, have like a set of questions that sort of go into the detail. You know, are you doing, you know, do you not screen out people because of sobriety? Do you not do, you know, all that sort of stuff? And you can get, you know, up to a certain number of points by checking out we follow all of those specific practices. I think if nothing else, it's really pays, especially for everybody to, you know, pay attention to if we say we're housing first, what is it we're saying we're doing? Because again, you know, HUD says it'll monitor on housing first, and they will do that in the future. So looking into something like that as another issue to include, I think that's and grant expenditure of grant funds. We want to hit that on two levels. We want both to, in the event that there really is, you know, consistent year after year underspending, we want to be able to intervene and do something to recapture. Plus the fact in the scoring, if you spent less than say 90% of your dollars in your last contract, then we think there should be some sort of a point reduction for that to also incentivize people to pay attention to that. I don't know, again, but some feedback. Was there anything that like was in the last thing that made no sense you'd like to see gone? And don't be on the spot now. I mean, think about it. This is important to your programs. Take a look at what, if you can, take a look at what we did last year. Give us some written feedback on that. And we're also going to come back with some revised things. And again, the goal is not to just impose things on anybody, is to come up with a set of ideas that may be pushing, you know, things a little and get some feedback as what's realistic and reasonable for folks. With the goal to have it really be a process that, you know, that is meaningful to us. Especially because, look, we know that there are real risks to being at the bottom of the list. You know, we were lucky this year. We were great this year. Maybe we weren't lucky. Maybe we were just great. But some years you can be at the bottom of the list and be at real risk. And we only, I don't want anybody to be at risk, but I want to be fair. And so the people who are at risk should be, the projects that are at risk should be those that are have performance less than the ones that are at the top of the list. Was there, did you have a question? Was there a question back to you? No? Okay. All right. Let's keep going. And here's my clicker. And hopefully I'll be on schedule. Okay. Okay, this is good. Right after lunch review. Who do you have to get that? Everybody's got to get this VAWA notice of occupancy rights. Who do you have to give this to? All adults. Yeah, you really have to. This like should be in their files all the way. Oh God. Can what circumstances? Can see? Don't stop it doing that. All right. Okay. So what circumstances can you ask for third-party documentation of evidence? So obviously, remember, you accept self-certification of DV unless there's a real reason to believe that something else might be going on. And sometimes that can happen. I mean, sometimes people don't understand that there are these rights, and they maybe will victimize folks in order to take advantage of those rights. So it's not a common thing. Do educational rights apply only to projects serving families? No, because anybody up, that's what we learned, right? It's up to below age 25, we've got to have those provisions. So again, even if you're doing a single adult permanent supportive housing project, if you check in the box that, you know, because they ask you is it's 25 to whatever, and then, you know, that they do that other box that says the 18 to 24, whatever, I forget what the exact thing is. If you're checking that thing, you're serving that 18 to 24-year-old age group. You've also, on that thing about you have a designated staff person informing folks of the rights, you've got to check that as well. Or else you, so, Lord. Okay, is that right? Okay, so here is, you know, I want to talk a little bit about monitoring. HUD will come and monitor on occasion. When they do come and monitor, it's serious business. You know, it isn't something you necessarily need to like have a corollary about, but it's something you want to be prepared for. I mean, you should always be prepared for a monitoring. They never come without notice. And they never come without telling you specifically what it is they're going to be looking at. I'm going to go, the next slide is going to show all the different things they can monitor for. They don't come and interpret everything. They'll tell you specifically what they're going to come and look at. And on top of that, should they do this, they don't just come, and do whatever it is they want to do. They follow their book. And their book, there's a link to their book here too, and it tells you the exact questions that they're going to be looking to get an answer to. And if you are, that's what you do. I mean, if you hear from them that they're going to come and monitor you, you go in here, you should do this in the front end, but if you haven't done it in advance, go look at that monitoring exhibit, look at the questions they're going to be asking, and make sure you're able to address all of those questions. Ideally, if you can, you will be in great shape. So this is the stuff, these are the areas that we look at. As I said, they're not going to look at every one of these things, but they will look for some of these things. This first one of beneficiaries, that is the participant eligibility, they will definitely check participant eligibility, they always check that. The housing thing, that's going to have to do with, is your unit in compliance with housing quality standards and things like that. They will check that. Remember, you've got any unit that's assisted has got to be inspected for housing quality standards prior to occupancy and annually thereafter. That is hugely important. HUD from the get-go has already said they do not want to spend their scarce dollars supporting substandard housing, and HUD never wants to see its dollars providing assistance to a unit that is not standard. I talked about match is a big deal. We'll talk about that a little bit, but they really, it's an easy thing for them to find an error with, and they like to find things that they can find errors with. They will pay attention to, and we're going to talk about this, is the subsidy calculation, because they like to pay attention to dollars. So if you're over-subsidizing folks, you're paying too much rental assistance to folks, or too much in leasing and things like that, they will pay. They will pay attention to that. They'll pay attention to rent reasonableness and things like that if you're doing any providing housing or leasing or rental assistance to folks. They may or may not talk about financial management, procurement, and cost allowability. All this stuff, we really don't do much in the way of procurement in these COC grants. So we'll get into that. Okay, so the takeaway on this is if you hear from them, they're going to monitor you. They're going to tell you which of these areas they're going to be looking at. If you have more than one grant, they'll tell you what grant and what grant year that they're looking at, because they'll be looking at a specific grant year. Then once they tell you that, go into this thing here, look at what the monitoring exhibit is, look exactly what it is they're going to be looking like, and make sure you can answer those questions. So, let's talk about this thing, about income verification. Very important, easy thing to potentially have a problem with. A lot of the stuff, especially when we're talking about rent calculations, a lot of the stuff, we're talking about those standard kind of Section 8 housing choice voucher, HUD's income rules that have been pretty much across the board in their programs, and a lot of deductions and dollar amounts and stuff like that have been so insanely consistent over the decades. Because a lot of these dollars amounts never change, like the disability reduction of $400 per household. Has been that number for ever. Yeah, I mean, since the 70s or so. And $400 in the 1970s is different than $400 in 2018, but don't matter. Okay. So if it is, remember there are a variety of different ways in which you can provide housing assistance to folks. One of the rental assistance is different than leasing. Rental assistance is very specific in the regulations as rental assistance. You know you've got rental assistance if in your budget you have a rental assistance exhibit that you are completing. HUD said that the definition of rental assistance is the lease is between the owner of the real property and your program participant. If you're drawing down funds on rental assistance, that has to be the way in which your leases are structured. If your lease is not structured that way, if you're drawing down funds under rental assistance, then the lease is between you as the provider and the owner of the real property, that is an issue. And it's not in compliance, so we need to address it. You're drawing funds as rental assistance, and it's under the tenant, the TRA component. You're going to have to make sure that the lease is between the participant and property owner. Even in the PRA, the project-based assistance, the lease is going to be that way, but you will be the property owner in that case. Remember, under rental assistance, some elements of the Continuum Care Program do not require that you charge participants rent. If you're receiving funds for rental assistance, it is mandated that folks be charged rent under rental assistance, so they must pay. And this is where it's that good old Section 8 rule is, of course, it's the greater of, the participant's contribution is the greater of 30% of their adjusted income. We will talk about what the adjustments are. 10% of the gross income, so there are some hugely varies. Almost always what they're paying is 30% of adjusted. There's some really rare things where 10% of gross becomes higher than 30% of adjusted, but almost always it's the higher of that. If you do not have I just trained in New York State where they actually have, they have public assistance, and not only that, that under so-called cash welfare assistance, which even in the days of TANF, the state continues to fund it out of state funds. There is general assistance in that state. And in that general assistance grant is a sum of money that's especially allocated. They call it the shelter allowance. And that is just for housing costs. And in a place like New York, that becomes what folks have to pay if that is greater than those other calculations. A little detail that you don't need for here. This is important because there's a lot of times we work with PHAs and things like that to administer what had been shelter plus care grants. A lot of times PHAs just kind of automatically do this stuff the way they do their stuff, which means that there are some cases where a PHA is administering this rental assistance and it's imposing a minimum rent because that's what they do in their voucher program. There are no minimum rents in the Continuum of Care program. If you've got a participant who's got zero income, they pay zero for rent. If you've got somebody who's got zero income, a handful. People, as we know, in our society do not live without money, without cash, and if people do not have a legitimate source of cash, you know this, you experience this, they will find other ways to get money in their pockets because they have to, because it's how we survive. So the goal, obviously, is to, as quickly as possible, connect people to a legitimate source of income, or else you have a lot even more work to do for folks. So, under rental assistance, because we also have the concept of the utilities and the utility allowance and how we handle that. HUD issued some guidance on this, so it's important to clarify what it is we do with this. So first of all, if it's rental assistance, remember the maximum that you can pay for rent is the reasonable rent. Under rental assistance, it is not HUD fair market rents. Those are not a ceiling on the rent. Under rental assistance, there's a difference between leasing and rental assistance. Under rental assistance, the maximum you can pay for rent is the reasonable rent. If the reasonable rent is higher than the fair market rents, you can go above the fair market rents. However, remember your contract, the dollars in your contract are never going to be beyond the fair market rent. So if you go above the fair market rent for some participants, you may have a budgetary issue. Hopefully you can do it because if you've got a tenant rental contribution coming in from your other tenants, that 30% of their income is going to reduce the amount they have to draw down on the other rental assistance line, and the budget will work going above the fair market rent. But you've got to pay attention to that because HUD does mandate that you serve the number of households that you've indicated that you're going to serve in your application. So if you are providing, because the reasonable rent is above the fair market rent and you're giving higher rents to folks, that can't translate into serving fewer people than you've identified that you're going to serve in the rate. That's important there. So what happens is, basically, their total housing cost is equal to the reasonable rent plus the utility allowance for their unit type. You find out every one of your PHAs is going to have its own schedule of utility allowances. The utility allowance is based on appliances in the home and the source of fuel that enriches those appliances, that fuels those appliances. And there are different dollar amounts, whether it's a gas or an electric stove and so on and so forth. But that adds up to a utility allowance, and every participant in the program is entitled to an allowance for their utility costs. The tenant portion of the rent is first applied toward their utility allowance. So if my share of the rent is $150, and I have a utility allowance of $100, that means that I'm going to be credited every month for $100 as my utility allowance, and I'm going to be required to pay a payment of $50 to my landlord. Right? That's, everybody gets how that works. In the event, so that was the scenario where my rental contribution was $150 and my utility allowance was $100. If my contribution to rent is $50 and my utility allowance is $100, in that scenario, I'm entitled to that $50. And basically, one way or another, as the provider, you can either give me, make a payment to me at $50, or make a payment on my behalf to my utility company. HUD will allow you to do either. And I think it becomes a question of what works best for you all in your program. You know there's always a risk about giving dollars to program participants insofar as, you know, we're dealing with folks who have no money and live in extreme poverty, and on any given day, there could be any number of compelling reasons to spend that money on something other than utilities. I get it. So sometimes it's better to, if you can, make the payment to the utility to be sure that it gets applied to it, but you're not required to do it.
So if I understand that rule correctly, though, the funds that are paying for those utilities cannot be HUD grant funds. The agency can pay that bill.
Well, no, you can pay out of HUD funds up to the utility allowance. You can't pay above the utility allowance, but you can pay up to the utility allowance.
With your rental assistance dollars.
Yeah, because I mean, in theory, fair market rents are inclusive of utilities. Now, by the way, when HUD or the PHAs deal with this stuff, especially the utility allowance, by regulation, they are supposed to set the utility allowance at the consumption of an energy-conserving household.
Which all of our tenants are.
Which none of the tenants are. Yeah, exactly. So that's you know, this came up before, in fact. You know, I was mentioning this to Jill. There are some places, like in Cleveland, for example, they have in their shelters, they have tenancy training programs that they have. They use the RentWise. Are you familiar with the RentWise program? It came out of university. It came out of Minnesota. It's and I can give you a link to it. It's a good online, you know, training curriculum that basically is a structured workbook-based training thing. I mean, certainly what we from Minnesota too. RentWise is a great thing, isn't it? One of the things that we do recognize is a lot of folks that we work with, you know, don't know. You know, have never had leases in their name, or it's been a long time since they had a lease in their name. Frankly, some of them just do not understand what tenancy is. I did focus groups with the folks in that men's shelter in Cleveland, and the one amazingly positive thing they had to say about their shelter experience was the training they got from that tenancy training course there, because they really felt it was giving them something very useful that they could take elsewhere. So when we talk about housing first, we really are talking about the whole system somewhat changing in the approach, and that means that shelter sees its goal as not just being to provide a safe place to people, which is huge. I shouldn't say just, that is hugely important. But beyond that, it's also equip people to move on past shelter, and that becomes this concept of, you know, let's get in this training so somewhere these folks have it before they come into permanent support housing and have some knowledge as to what they need to do. So, okay, we're going here. So the tenant gets first applied to the utility allowance balance. Goes to the rent. If the tenant payment, my 30% of my income is less than the utility allowance, one way or another, I have to get credited and get the funds to pay the difference in the utility allowance that is not coming out of my pocket. Go ahead.
You may be getting to this, so we can hold a bit, but we have leasing dollars. Are you about to cover leasing?
Yep.
Okay.
Okay. Yeah, and it's slightly different. Slightly, just to make it so complex for everybody, we're going to treat that differently.
Yeah, of course, right?
So here it is. Same thing, and the regulations say, like I said, in rental assistance, uncategorically, no question whatsoever, if you draw down funds on the rental assistance line, they have to pay rent. If you're doing leasing, you can make a programmatic decision as to whether or not you're going to charge participants rent. It's up to you. You know, the COC, we could, on a COC level, say our policy is under leasing. You have to, that is allowable, we've done that now. So you could, if you got funds on the leasing line, you could say, you know, I'm going to pay 100% of the rent out of our leasing and rent it. However, HUD would say, you know, once you say, no, they have to pay rent, then the only way they can pay rent is according to HUD's the same formula that we had before. However, I think I'm going to get here now. So, okay, so let's go with the other differences. I think it's going to come up in a future slide. Under leasing, fair market rents are the ceiling. So it's take away, under leasing, the most you can pay is the lesser of the reasonable rent or the fair market rent. Under rental assistance, the max you can pay is the reasonable rent. Under leasing, it's either, you know, both are going to be a ceiling. So you can't go above the fair market rent, but if the reasonable rent is below the fair market rent, you can't pay the fair market rent. So it means leasing or rental assistance, one thing that's got to be in every participant file is a rent reasonableness determination, because that is determining how much you're going to pay for subsidies. So HUD is definitely going to look at that. It sounds more intimidating than it is. Remember, when you're doing a rent reasonableness, what you have to do is document 3 comparable units. And just basically they're comparable because they're gonna have similar amenities, they're gonna have a similar location. And basically you just need to show that the amount that you're charging is in line with those comparable units. And if what you're paying is a little above that, as long as you say there's a, there's an elevator in my building, there isn't in that building, that's why it's a little higher than that. As long as you can justify it, it is going to be fine. The other side of rent reasonable, there's sort of two sides of it. It can't be more than comparable units in the community, A, and B, it can't be more than the property owner charges for similar units that he or she owns. So it's those two tests, and you have to establish both those tests. The property owner has to certify that he or she is not charging you more than he or she charges similar units that are unassisted, and you need to make the determination that there are 3 comparable units. There are some online resources that can help with this. There's a program called Go Section 8 that will give you a list of units that are available for rent within the Section 8 things. A lot of people use that to generate the data for their rent reasonableness. But it's very, 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 very important.
The one thing I think, another thing that might be different, I'm wanting your clarification is, in leasing situations, there are circumstances in which utilities are charged to the client, to the tenant. We're having situations where the landlord will not take on the utility charge.
Yep.
But we cannot pay that with leasing dollars.
Well, the same thing. They get the same utility allowance. You can do the same utility. You can again you can support them up to the utility allowance.
Right. But my understanding is, I thought my understanding was that if we were paying them money back, like if their payment, their occupancy charge was determined to be lower than the utility charges.
Yep.
That we can't pay them from leasing dollars. We have to pay them from operations money. That's what we've been told by HUD. I'm actually asking you maybe to get clarification if you know differently, or that was our understanding from HUD, but sometimes it's hard to get a clear answer from HUD, but nobody's experienced that before.
No.
So that's what we were told, is that has to be operations dollars, not leasing dollars.
Let me follow up on that.
With the chalkboard, is that
Yeah, please.
the parking lot?
Yeah, please, note that. I want to dig in a little on that issue.
Okay, great.
Remember when I said these things are carved in stone and never change ever? So I said these dollar amounts are crazy. I mean, I say 2 things about them. We deal with people in such extreme poverty that, when you divide 400 by 12 and come up with, 30 some odd dollars, that's meaningful money for folks. So we have to pay all, even though these numbers are crazy, we have to pay attention to them. Number 2, HUD actually, not HUD, Congress passed a law back in 2016 called the Housing Opportunities Through Modernization Act, with the wonderful acronym of HOTMA. And it's going to change a lot of stuff as to how a lot of these programs operate. The way they passed this law was they said, we're making these changes, but they're not going to take effect until such time as HUD issues the implementing regulations. HUD ain't working on 8 cylinders these days. They ain't working on 4, I think they were like, well, whatever. So it's taken them, it may take them a little while to issue the regulations that we're going to need. There are some elements of this HOTMA that have been implemented. I'll talk about where they're going to impact what we're doing. But it will impact this stuff. They are saying, when they implement the regulations, this $400 deduction, that's 1 deduction per household. If the household is either elderly, which means the head of household is 62 or older, or disabled, which we know, means a certain number of things, but only certain people can document that here in Indiana. But that $400 number is going to zoom up to $525. Whoa, not yet though, hasn't happened yet. The other thing that is going to happen though is both of these deductions are going to, once they implement the regulations, be indexed to the cost of living, so that these things will not be forever numbers, but actually will change as the cost of living goes up, so they may have some relationship to some kind of reality. for folks. So I guess I'm just highlighting you. These rules have been in effect forever. There are going to be some changes in these dollar amounts that we're dealing with. So remember, any dependent in the household is entitled to that $480 deduction. You get each one for each dependent. A dependent is a kid under 18 years of age. A full-time student, as long as that full-time student is not the head or the co-head of the household, is also a dependent and eligible for that $480 deduction. So remember, it's either under 18 or a full-time student. Full-time studenthood is determined by the educational institution. So this school here would have a thing, whatever it is, a certain number of course load that you have to maintain to be considered a full-time student here. Whatever that educational institution determines a full-time student is what you determine a full-time student to be. So everybody gets those deductions, right? And you're all doing that. If anybody, every family that you're serving, individual family that you're serving in permanent supportive housing, better have that $400 deduction on their thing, because they are by definition, I mean, if they're not getting it, then they're not a disabled household, which means they're not eligible to be in the program to begin with, which is not a good thing. So everybody should be getting that $400 deduction for being an elderly disabled household. People can deduct reasonable. Remember, whenever you're dealing with the federal government, the word before every expenditure is reasonable. And the goal is, and I actually like it because it really is sort of a common sense thing. I think reasonable says, if you are paying out of your pocket with your money, would you pay that price for that? As opposed to it's the federal dollar, so who the heck cares what gets paid for? So people can deduct child care expenses if they need the child care to either go to work or to increase their skills by education or something like that to make them more employable. If they're getting a child care deduction to go to work, the amount that you can deduct is limited by how much you earn. So if I've got a job that pays me $150 a week, and I got a child that's below 13, who's eligible for that deduction, is it 11? Because in age, they gotta be young. They gotta be young. I'll check that's 11 or 13. Young. I can. Does somebody know that number? 13. Is it? Thank you. I should check. Trust my judgment. Okay. Basically, if I'm earning $150, I can't deduct more than $150 for my child care expense. It is capped by what it is that by what you're earning. Of course, if I use it to go to school, I'm not earning anything, so that cap is not in place. You also. If you've got an elderly or disabled household, they are eligible for these two other deductions, but in order to be able to get those other deductions, you have to first be an elderly or disabled household. And this deduction only occurs, this is going to change under Hot Month 2. Right now the rule is, to the extent to which these expenses exceed 3% of your gross income, they are deductible. Under Hot Month, that's going to change to 10%. It's going to be a different game. Now it's only 3%. You have to calculate what 3% of the gross income is, and the extent to which these expenses exceed that. One is unreimbursed medical expenses. That is very, 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 very broadly construed. So that would mean, if you've got somebody who's on Social Security, and their Social Security check is being reduced because of their Medicare premium that's being deducted from it, that Medicare premium is an unreimbursed medical expense and should be applied towards this thing. If they have copays in order to see a provider, if they have a deductible on their insurance, anything like that, that is an allowable deductible medical expense. If they have to pay out of pocket to go to a medical appointment, and they are taking into account whatever they're doing to get there, and they've got receipts and they can document that expenditure, the cost of going to that appointment counts. If they require prescription eyewear, and it's not otherwise covered by any kind of insurance that they have, same thing with dental services, that they require to be medically necessary for those services and not covered by insurance and stuff like that, they're paying out of pocket. If the doctor prescribes an over-the-counter medication, low-dose aspirin or something like that, that is an unreimbursed medical expense that could be eligible for deduction. I will talk about what we do about the expenses of service animals in a few minutes, but guess what? You can see where that's going if you've got a legitimate service animal. So we'll talk about that in a minute. So a lot of things, something to pay attention to. If your participants are indeed seeing doctors frequently, depending on if they've got co-pays, if they've got premiums and stuff like that, maybe they've got expenses, they're gonna push them above that 3%, and that's an allowable deduction for them. So pay attention to people who have some pretty complex medical needs that we're serving. This next, the final one, is unreimbursed reasonable attendant care and auxiliary apparatus expenses. What this is about is we've got a disabled household. And in order for somebody in that household to leave the home and go to work, it can either be the person with disabilities or the person who doesn't have disabilities who is attending to the person with disabilities. In order for either one of those people to leave the unit and go to work, if there are additional expenses that are incurred, so if I'm the non-disabled person, I've got to leave the unit to go to work, but my partner, if I leave him by himself, he can't be by himself, so there's got to be an attendant there to look after him when he's by himself. The cost of that attendant care, if it's not reimbursed, is an allowable deduction from my expenses. If I'm the handicapped disabled person, in order for me to leave the home and go to work, I need something special. I need a handicap van. Maybe I need a electric wheelchair that's not covered completely by insurance, something like that. That kind of apparatus cost would be allowable as a deduction as well. Again, it's got to be related to having a disabled household where somebody is leaving the home to go to work. And again, it has to, of course, always be unreimbursed. If you're getting paid for that electric powered wheelchair from some other source, we're not going to pay for it under this.
The accommodation has to be related to their disability, though, right? It couldn't be I'm mentally ill, I need to go to work, and I need a car. Right? I need transportation to get to work.
Yeah, I would buy that, yes. Yep. Okay, all right, so here's an example of how this thing works. I think it's pretty clear. I hate doing numbers in front of people, so hopefully it works out. So we've got a typical situation, he's probably on disability or something. His income is no more than $750 a month, and his rent, including utilities, is $950. Obviously, with the absence of a subsidy, we got a problem. But fortunately, Joe does have a subsidy. So his total housing cost is going to be equal to both his reasonable rent and his utility allowance, which in this case is going to total that $1,075. His income, we're adjusting his monthly income. We're subtracting out that $400. We're basically doing the monthly equivalent of the $400 annual deduction and subtracting it out. So basically, his adjusted monthly income becomes this $716. Therefore, he's going to pay 30% of that adjusted income for rent, which seems to come up to this $214. We said we credit him for the utility allowance, so we take $125 out of that $214, and hey presto, it means that on a monthly basis, he's going to pay $89 to the landlord for rent. These calculations make sense to you? Do they follow what you're doing? Or do they follow what you could be doing in the future?
And this is for all COC, so even rapid rehousing programs, that's.
Thank you so much. That's such a great question.
I hope you say no, because I'm starting to sweat.
That is such a great question. God bless HUD. They use this term rental assistance, and they act as if therefore we'd be consistent in what that means from one component of our program to another, but they aren't consistent with that. So under rapid rehousing, basically HUD says the COC determines what happens. So
Perfect answer.
Sorry?
That's the perfect answer, thank you. Because we have that, good.
You don't want me to go, you want me to just sort of stop
That's
there?
good. Yes, thank you.
I'm not going to though. Because Joe and I were talking, and we think that we really, and this is not something we do, but I think it'd be really useful to, and I think we're talking about one, look, rapid rehousing is a new and it's a different approach, and it's something we all want to put our minds together on the way to implement it best. People go, COCs go all over the map on these things. I know a lot of COCs that basically say, pass it on to the provider. As long as, what you're doing is consistent with the regulations, it's fine with us. Other COCs are far more proscriptive than that, like in Connecticut, for example. They have a very, very strict program. What they're going to say is, for the first 3 months, and what they're trying to do is separate the subsidy from the person's, that direct relationship between the subsidy and people's income. So people have a huge disincentive to increase their income because if their income goes up, their subsidy goes down, so why bother? And since rapid rehousing is such a time-limited assistance anyway, what they say is that basically, they say every month people have to pay they have to do that 30% of income. first 3 months of the program, it will subsidize up to 100% of the fair market rent, but basically that declines over time. So the amount of subsidy you can get from the program is going to decline over the course of the year. So basically it becomes, the burden that folks are going to have to pay is going to go up basically in quarterly increments to sort of adjust them to the fact that the subsidy is going to go away. Of course, when they do that, there are always provisions that, you know, if that increase in rent is going to force those folks to become homeless, then obviously we're going to, you know, reevaluate that and not do that. So I think that, you know, under rental assistance for rapid rehousing, whether or not people have to pay rent, how much of their income, even under rental assistance for rapid rehousing, that 30% of income is not a restriction, so you can charge more than 30% of income for rent in rapid rehousing. It really is how the COC, along with their providers, wish to develop that program.
And there's no utility allowance, there's no funding.
Oh, there could be, yeah, you know, otherwise you can do this utility allowance that we're doing otherwise in rental assistance. Yes, you could. Yes, you could, because we're still working off those same, ultimately it's coming down to those fair market rent schedules, and those fair market rent schedules are in theory inclusive of that. So when you're following fair market rents, you have to do under that too as well. So you can do the utility allowance. Again, but you know, you can, unlike, you know, permanent supportive housing where basically it's going to, you know, it's a flat line, you know, under rapid rehousing, you know, the subsidy amount is usually expected, in many cases, going to diminish over the length of their participation. So and we were talking about probably having another session. Rapid rehousing is so different and such a new program that we think we really need to a separate session just focused in on that topic, I really think, because otherwise it's just, and we have more opportunity for decision making there too, so it would be useful to bring up the knowledge base so we can, you know, make those decisions on how we want to run it. Okay. Another calculation. All right. So she's in transitional housing, which there aren't many people anymore, but she's not disabled, so we did that to not have to do that calculation. Her income is 2 months. So we see. So her, in this case, we're calling it an occupancy fee, but here again, we got her utility allowance for her. So both her occupancy expense and her utility allowance end up being $725. She has no adjusted income adjustment. Basically, we're not changing her income at all. So 30% of her income is going to be the $66. That's well below her utility allowance. So even in that transitional thing, we are going to give her payment for the utility allowance that she's not receiving. Under the assumption, if she's paying her utilities directly, she's going to need some resources to pay for those utilities. As we know, failure to keep the lights on is a lease violation, number one, and huge risk to life and safety. And a huge risk. I mean, that happens, right? Your utilities do get shut off so fast with you. Yeah, it's a real problem. It is a real problem. What counts as income? What doesn't count as income? Which we're going to be our next slide, so I guess I wouldn't answer that yet. So anything that regularly comes to the household is income. Certainly salary is income. Certainly any benefits, certainly cash benefits that the household regularly receives, all of that is income. If you have a situation where there's somebody outside the household that is regularly contributing income to that household, it could take the form of alimony, it could take the form of child support, it could take the form of grandparents who have grandkids, who have some means, and who are making a monthly check of $200 to their daughter so that she can make sure that her kids are fed and their grandkids are fed. If that's the case, if you have grandparents that are writing a check for $200 to that family each month, you're going to have to count that as income. If you've got grandparents who are dropping off 8 bags of groceries each month to that household, and these days 8 bags of groceries are probably worth $500. But whatever it is, we don't have to count that. We don't have, if they want to get them food, we don't have to count that. We don't count that as income. But if they really are regularly providing cash income, we have to count that as cash income. If they get gifts to their grandchildren at Christmas and on their birthday, that is not income. That's them giving occasional gifts to folks when it's allowed to do that. Okay, I think it's clear. Any confusion as to what we would consider to be income?
Grandparents paying the cell phone bill, we have to count that, right?
If they do it every month, yeah, absolutely. It's a regular source of thing. Remember the other side, the cruel side, is the other side of the child support equation. So if your client is the one who's paying the child support, We cannot pay attention to that. We cannot deduct that from your client's income. And this times, sometimes we can't house people because of this. It's really horrible. Because we have to assume that they can pay $400 a month, say hypothetically, even though they're paying that money, God bless them, as their child support thing. We can't help them. They have to. The system does not recognize that. It's cruel. So what we don't count, there is some income we don't count. Obviously, if it's employment income from kids, they get a right to work after school, and bless their hearts, every dollar they earn for their after-school job goes into their pocket, and they can do whatever they want, or they and their parents think is the best thing for them to do with that income. If you have got a full-time student above the age of 18 who is still dependent, you do not count that full-time student earned income to the extent that it exceeds $480 because they're getting that dependent deduction of $480. So you count the first $480 to wipe out the dependent deduction, and then you don't count any more of the earned income of a full-time student under the age of 25. Temporary, non-recurring, or sporadic income or gifts. Okay, this is a challenging one. Because it sometimes becomes hard to, what is the difference between a temporary, sporadic, and regular income, especially day labor, casual labor, and stuff like that. Is that temporary, sporadic, or is that regular? There's judgment in there really is. I mean, if they are regularly, at Home Depot doing that, and that is how they come up with the income they need to pay their share of the rent, to pay their utilities, then that's probably something you're going to count. If there was a bad snowstorm last week and somebody had an extra shovel and earned a couple $100 because they were able to do a lot of shoveling, but there wasn't another snowstorm for another 6 weeks, then we would consider that to be temporary, non-recurring income and not have to count it. The classic case that we work on here is the lottery. If people, when you win the lottery, you can either take it as a lump sum, or you can take it in periodic payments over 20 years or something like that. If you take the periodic payments, that is most definitely income. If they take it as a lump sum, we consider it to be a lump sum addition to the household's assets. We do not consider that to be income. So taking away the lottery things, that's a bit like lightning strikes. To examples that could happen more frequently, people can get an inheritance. People can get an insurance settlement. God forbid they'll get hit by a car or something like that. That can happen to people's lives, and they will get a check. If something like that happens, and we'll get to how you treat assets next, but if something like that happens, we call that an increase in their assets. We do not consider that to be income. Go ahead.
What about somebody that's had a problematic job history, significant turnover, hard time holding down the job, but they got a new full-time, part-time, whatever, it's documented. How long do you wait before you consider that to be permanent versus?
Oh, no, you would. I mean, well, basically, when they're liable when they get the job. HUD does not, what HUD says you must do, first of all, it says you must verify income upon program entry and annually thereafter, and you must do that annually. HUD also says that when you're notified by your participant of a change in income, you should readjust their subsidy as soon as it's practicable to do that. You are not, and they, in earlier versions, they were more explicit about this, but you are not necessarily required to, the second, in between examinations, you're not necessarily required, if the income goes up, you are not necessarily, you can re-examine and recalculate, but you're not required to do, you're only required to do that annually. That really becomes your decision as to what makes the most sense. So in that case, you could have a little discretion there. Clearly, if it's an annual recertification, it doesn't matter, they just got a job a week ago. You've got to look at that, whatever their income is then. Remember, what HUD is talking about is anticipated income, by the way. That's what you're basing it on, is what you anticipate. You're looking forward. And so if you have reason to and believe that their anticipated income is different and you can justify that, you can do it differently because you are basing it on anticipated income. HUD also would say, again, if you have a case where what they earn changes so frequently, you can do more frequently. You can say, okay, we're going to redo your income and check every quarter or something like that because there's just so much variability there. We want to be equitable and fair to you. So again, the primary things are annual, on entry and annually, no leeway whatsoever. You've got to, you've got to adjust it. In between times, the only thing that's really critical, and obviously, they're going to tend to tell you that their income has gone down quicker than they're going to tell you. Generally speaking, human beings being what they are. But if they're telling you that their income goes down, the regulations do require that you recalculate as soon as you can, so as to not put them in a situation where they lose their housing. So I hit the lump sum addition, and I sort of hit any medical expense reimbursement. So if they get any payments coming into them for medical expenses and stuff like that, of course, is not income. Live-in aid. If you're working with a disabled household, and that person with disabilities needs a live-in aid in order to live independently in the community, a live-in aid is defined by HUD as a person who is essential to the care and well-being of someone with disabilities, is somebody who is not otherwise obligated for the support of the person with disabilities, and is somebody who would not be living in the unit were it not to provide services to the person with disabilities. That is a live-in aid if somebody meets that definition. So obviously, you should have some outside documentation. This person needs a live-in aid to be able to live in the community there. If they meet that definition of a live-in aid, two things happen. They should be provided a unit with one more bedroom, because that live-in aid is not required to share a bedroom with anyone. They should have their own private bedroom. And the live-in aid is not a member of the household. They're not a member of the family. That means two things. It means that if the person they're assisting passes, or if any reason is no unit, by live-in aid, they've got no right of survivorship, nothing like that. They've got to be gone from the unit as well, number one. And the other thing it means is you pay no attention to their income, because they're not a member of the family, of the household. They are there just to perform a function. A live-in aid does not have to be in the unit 24 hours a day. A live-in aid does not have to be a licensed, credentialed professional, anything like that. A live-in aid could also have a job, but is in the unit sufficient amount of time to provide the services necessary as a live-in aid. There are certain family members that cannot be a live-in aid. A spouse could never be a live-in aid because of those two things, not obligated for the support and would not otherwise be living in the unit. Generally speaking, if you don't want to live in the same unit as your spouse, rethink the relationship. Because that's what it's supposed to be about, right? I mean, it doesn't always work, I get it, but and on top of that, if you do become a spouse, you do become responsible for the support of your spouse. That's the sickness and health, all that kind of thing. So spouses can't do it, but parents maybe could. So if your person with disabilities is not a minor, I use an example of veterans a lot. If somebody is disabled, need the support of somebody. A mother could be a live-in aid for somebody. She would not be obligated to support because that veteran or that person is no longer, a minor. And generally speaking, moms don't live with adult children unless there's some real reason why that's going on. So there are those circumstances where a family member could actually qualify as a live-in aid as long as they don't disqualify this other test. But beware, if you do put mom in with her son or daughter, again, that son or daughter leaves the unit, we got no mercy for mom. She's out too, even though she was a mother at the same time. And remember, the same thing we said, those families of choice, or whatever you want to call them, the group of people, once they've called themselves a family, anybody who's a member of that family, we're paying attention to their income, that is for sure. You can't be a member of the family and not have a financial obligation to the family. Any kind of student financial aid, and they really clarified this to mean, textbook assistance, lots of other, so any support that's provided by virtue of student assistance is not considered income. And then there's also this provision that you can provide, limited resident service stipends. So say you've got a single site building, and you've got a front desk or something like a security desk. You could have, residents alternate, sitting at that desk, giving them $25 a shift or something like that. Don't exceed this $200 a month, and that is completely legitimate. That is completely legitimate.
Sorry, Social Security back pay?
Yeah, good. Yep. That's going to be a lump sum addition, because that's going to be that's going to be what we would call in New York a SOTA check. It's large. That's going to come into the account, so we're consider that an increase for that, since we don't consider that to be income. The only thing we're going to talk about is what is the regular check from Social Security, the regular monthly check from Social Security. The VA sometimes will get a big that deferred payment, whatever it is they call that. Assets. So we talked about assets. So those lump sums are going to go into the assets. So a couple things about assets. First of all, everybody's entitled to have personal property. So like, you don't go around trying to value the TV that folks have and the couches and the bed. You don't pay attention to that at all. And on top of that, they are allowed to have, a reasonable car, especially if that is how they get to work and stuff like that. We don't consider that car to be a part of their assets either. Well, we're looking at it as assets, or either, first of all, we pay attention to nothing unless they have more than $5,000 that we can consider to be an asset. So, it's savings. If they have a savings account and there is, $800 in that savings account, we don't pay attention to. In theory, the interest income that they get is dollars this year. You could count that, because we do count interest income, but we don't really need to make a big attention to that. What could happen is there are times that people own real property. It might not be improved, might not have housing, just odd. Maybe they inherited something can happen. You could own something like that. If they were to own a piece of real property like that, especially if it's not a house, not something they're going to be living in, what you would do is, the first thing that you would do is you would figure out what the cost of turning that asset into cash is. Because if it's real property, even if I own a lot that's worth $40,000, I'm not going to get $40,000. Even if I get $40,000, I'm going to pay a broker. I've got closing. I've got other costs that I've got to pay out of pocket. So even if I sell it for $40,000, I'm going to end up with 36 or something less than an amount of money. So you deduct the amount of money it'll take to convert that asset into cash, and you can reasonably deduct that amount of money. And then you apply HUD's passbook savings rate to the value of that asset. HUD's passbook savings rate, those of you who've got savings know, the passbook savings rate ain't a great thing. HUD considers the passbook savings rate, interest rate, to be 0.06%. That's 0.06%. Remember, that's a percentage, so there's 2 decimal places before that 6 before you apply. So basically, as this little example says, if they had $50,000 a year in income, when you apply the savings rate times that, it turns into very, 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 very little money. So, not that you folks have got a lot of assets or anything like that, but in case you run into the situation, this is how you handle it. As I said, is that clear about the assets? I know something I find fascinating. I don't think we run into it all that often. Said you must do it initially and at least annually. All household member must be made as changes of income are identified, but you don't have to identify those changes of income except when you must identify them annually. People have got to, even though it's housing first, people have got to provide information on their income and provide you with the information that you need to calculate what their appropriate subsidy is. HUD requires that you do that. Therefore, you can indeed terminate folks for failure to supply the information that you need for income documentation. They are not, even though we're housing first, they are not allowed to not provide that information. There can be times, and we're going to get to reasonable accommodations in a minute. There can be times, you may have somebody with a severe mental health issue, and their severe mental illness is going to get in the way of their participating in something like that. That can happen, or providing with the information. Then we want to be respectful. We want to note the fact that we're going to make a reasonable accommodation for, if we need to do that, that they just can't do it, and we can tie it to that. We'll work to do what we can. But if we can really relate to a disability, we want to document that in the violence. It's risky, but sometimes you can't ask people to do what they can't do. And so you can document the fact that you can't do. I've seen that as a reasonable accommodation, or they'll insist, you can't let somebody enter your program because they refuse to sign these documents. Well, sometimes people got some intense paranoia or something, just won't let them sign a document. Then we've got to find a way around that. That really is what we've got to find a reasonable accommodation for, because we don't want to deny assistance just because somebody's disability won't let them do something we need to do. But except in those very extreme circumstances, people have got to give you that income information. They've got to have that income information in your file. Remember, it's third-party verification that HUD is always looking for. So when you are, we're going to, in your file, participant's file, we're going to be looking for how you calculated what their gross income was, and we're going to see in there that you got some backup for that gross income. If it's based on benefit income, we want a copy of the Social Security check that they're receiving, or the Social Security determination letter in there. If it's wages, we want those W-2s, or whatever pay stubs. Whatever we have that's a third-party documentation as to what that income is. Very important that we have it. Is that clear? Yeah. So, and all this is saying is, don't, there are going to be minor fluctuations in income. Don't go crazy about that. Try and, only really change it when it seems like it's a permanent change in their income, and probably only readjust their income when it's reaching a threshold like $50 a month or something like that. That's meaningful. Don't drive yourselves. I mean, you can have staff spending all their time adjusting, readjusting, re-verifying income, and in theory, they could be doing things that are more helpful to folks during that period of time. You know what the regulations mandate? They mandate that you look at this annually and make sure you're doing that. Okay, there are some housing requirements to meet before you use continuum care funds. Let's talk about those. I mentioned this. Every unit that is assisted must meet, HUD is not going to support substandard housing. The housing quality standards are, for the most part, intelligible to lay people. They are not sophisticated. HUD has done this. Now, are you folks doing your own HQS inspections? Yeah. You know that there is a potential conflict of interest in housing quality inspection. So obviously, if you own the unit, you cannot do your own. So if it's your own property, if it's a single site project-based thing, obviously you cannot do the housing quality inspection on that, because whether there is a financial benefit to you if the unit passes, and a financial consequence if the unit doesn't pass, so you can't make that determination by yourself. So if that is the case, you've got to get some outside third party to do that inspection for you. I know some COs in Connecticut, what happens is that providers do them for each other. Sometimes, so you can't inspect your own unit, so I'll have an inspector from a sister agency inspect my unit, I'll have my inspector go inspect their units, and that's a way to avoid that conflict of interest. You've got to do it annually. If the unit does not pass HQS, you are not allowed to expend HUD rental assistance or leasing dollars on behalf of that unit. It is important. HUD is definitely going to check if they come and monitor to make sure that there is a HQS form in each participant file, and it is going to be a significant finding if they come in and do not find those HQS inspections. And it's got to happen annually, at least, obviously. And hopefully you have got good things. One thing that happens fairly commonly in other places is that re-inspection can cause a problem. That either the participant is not around, they can't get to the unit. In Section 8, it happens all the time. People use their subsidies because they're not around for the re-inspection thing and stuff like that. So there's a re-inspection requirement. Make sure you're working with your clients so that they're around and we can get into the unit and do the inspection when it is necessary to do it. HOTMA is changing these inspection things. We're already seeing it happen in the Section 8 program, where a lot of PHAs are allowed to move to every other year inspection now. That sort of stuff, these changes trickle down slowly to the continuum care side. So one of these days, I think that may come over to our side, but it still is not there in our regulations. So we are still required to do annual inspections. Lead-based paint is really important. It is conclusively been demonstrated through science that exposure to lead is extraordinarily harmful to developing brains and causing lifelong problems to folks. That's certainly not what we want to do to the kids that we are trying to help. So remember, lead-based paint rules apply, and they apply to any unit that was constructed prior to 1978. They outlawed lead-based paint in 1978, so in theory, anything that was painted on a surface after 1978 cannot contain lead, because we don't have it anymore. The building has to be constructed prior to 1978, and there's got to be a kid. So it's either there's going to be a child 6 years of age or under in the unit, or you've got a pregnant mom who's in the unit. That's when it's going to trigger the possibility of a lead-based paint hazard. If that happens, you must, if you've got housing that's before 1978 and children, you must do a visual assessment for lead-based paint. We're looking at deteriorated paint surfaces. There was a time that we thought what was going on is the kids were eating paint chips. That's what we thought was going on with the lead-based paint. I think the more sophisticated understanding is what we're talking about is lead dust. And that lead-based paint, even on all circumstances, is going to be shedding some of that dust, and it gets onto the floor, it gets onto their toys, it gets into their mouths, basically, because it's if there is deteriorated paint that is more than what HUD calls a de minimis amount, you can't occupy that unit unless it is remediated. There is an online training course to do the visual assessment that will allow you to determine A, whether or not there is a deteriorated paint surface and whether it exceeds this de minimis threshold. That online training course will allow you, will equip you to make that determination. This is the link to how you get to that online training course. When you complete that online training course, you get a certificate suitable for placement in your cubicle. But you can't, anytime building before 1978, children 6 years of age or younger, pregnant women, you must show that you've done this visual assessment for lead-based paint hazard. Not as an important regulation, but this really is important for kids too. So it's an important thing to do humanely. In theory, believe it or not, HUD would say that if tenant-based rental assistance and you come up with a place where you believe there's a lead-based paint hazard, you are supposed to notify your local health department that you've located that, and they're supposed to keep a log of this information. That is what the regulations require for. And also that, if they're going, HUD has got available on its website a pamphlet about the lead-based paint hazards. Should be readily understandable. Again, whenever you've got a case where it applies, you want to give that household the information about lead-based paint. HUD has been on this issue since the 70s. I talked about rent reasonableness. I think I got all of these, I hit all these points already, so I won't reiterate it now, but remember, that's the same thing. If you have got, certainly if you're doing leasing or rental assistance, each one of the bullet board participants file has got to have a rent reasonableness determination in it.
Got a comment on the slide back there under leasing about maybe charged an occupancy charge. Can you expound on that?
Well, which is the same thing as rent. So it's just using several more syllables to say rent. Because it is not a mandated payment as it is under rental assistance. That's why we're calling it an occupancy charge. But it is the equivalent of rent under leasing. And it has to follow the same rules about the 30% of it. Is that help?
Just another term then again.
Yeah. It's the same thing for transitional housing. We kind of call it an occupancy charge because it's somewhat different. And also we know under leasing, the thing that differentiates it is under leasing, the lease is going to be between the owner of the property and the HUD recipient, which would be your agency. And then you're going to enter into either a sublease or sometimes it's called an occupancy agreement with the participant. And so if you enter into an occupancy agreement, that's what we're talking about, occupancy charges. So remember, rent reasonableness, gotta do it. And on top of that, maybe it can help you too, because it does allow you to pay more than the, maybe, in order to house your family, you need to go above the fair market rent. Rent reasonableness gives you the opportunity to do that.
Unless it's leasing, right?
That's right.
Yeah.
Because here we go. This slide finally says it. So in rental assistance, the maximum rent you can charge is the reasonable rent. Under leasing, the maximum is the lesser of the fair market rent or the reasonable rent. Please don't ask me why they did that. I think HUD makes all these rules and makes these subtle differences in rules just to give you the opportunity to mess up. I really think they do that. I mean, and then they can gotcha. I mean, Lord knows that's how they used to do so much of these continuing care applications. I mean, it's like they just changed. I was just trying to get Jill last night. Used to be every year you had to enter in the information from your point in time count into the HUD application. Now they are automatically just in their data system to begin with. I think the only reason why they did that is to give you an opportunity to enter in the wrong number and they could go, aha, you made a mistake. They've got the numbers already. Why are they doing that? So I think they do that. A lot of this stuff is like, it's, there's so much more need than there is resources to do it. So we've got to find a way to limit the resources, and we're going to find little human errors is the way we'll limit the assistance we give. Yes. That's how they structured it. Okay. Well, let's do this. Okay. conflicts of interest, I think this is important. You shouldn't get in trouble on this thing. And again, I one time was sitting in a meeting where the executive director of a really nice nonprofit organization up in the Twin Cities, his hand was shaking because he was ordered by HUD to write a check to the federal government back on something. And here's what he did. He had his wife had a PhD in social work, which I guess means that she could do a disability determination. And in this case, what happened is, so his wife is a PhD social worker. And as we know, this is complex clinical work, and and his staff are like, BAs. And so he brought his wife in to do some training of his case management staff, because she was, extraordinarily skilled and had the background for it, and on top of that, charged about a third of what you would normally charge for that stuff. Again, the way his hand shook as he had to write a check to the federal government to cover all those payments that he made to his wife, and he thought, he was helping his staff, and and his wife was doing a good thing by charging like next to nothing. You can't hire a family member to do work under this program. Family members can't get any benefit. There is, and on top of that, remember, HUD kind of changed the rules, so the conflict of interest rules not only are while you're employed by the organization, they hang around for a year after you've left employment with that organization. So if somebody's left your organization, you can't then go in and then hire them to do some consulting or additional work or something like that, if there's going to be a conflict situation in there. So it's any any immediate family member, anything like that. Basically, the concept is, and we get it. The only benefit that you should get from your job working on this program is the salary you get for performing the job. The other thing that sometimes comes up is, a family, some of our clients are really hard to house. And, somebody, maybe got a brother-in-law who owns a multi-family building, and, I can't get anyone except my tenant, and I can sort of twist my brother-in-law's arm. And, he will take a tenant that no one else will take. Well, he can't take that for the woman. And I can't steer somebody to a family membership, even if that's the only house they can find in the community. They can't do it, because there's going to be some financial benefit to another member of the family. Similarly, we know on things like housing quality inspections, rent reasonableness, things like that, if you're the owner of the real property, you can't do your own HQS, you can't do your own rent reasonableness determination on that property. You've got to get somebody on the outside to do it, because it's, you have a conflict of interest. PHAs have the same issue. PHAs, housing authorities, sometimes own their own housing. When the housing authority owns the housing, it can't send its inspectors in to inspect its own housing. It's got to have some third party come in and inspect those units. It just, even recognized agencies, so it says, you're conflicted. You can't make those determinations. Is that clear about, because conflict of interest is something one can get caught on, and as I said, it's really, really painful for folks to, it's kind of humiliating too for folks to get caught up in that one. So be careful about that. Can't lease structures, yep. So you can't lease anything. Can't do these HQS, rent reasonableness, or even lead-based payment inspections. All of those things would determine whether or not subsidy comes to those units, and there's a financial statement. Is there a conflict of interest if, I don't know what this says, why does it always do that? There's like a lot of Indiana and something else. Oh, it's just, okay, all right. A former board member offers to provide legal services at a reduced rate. So the operative word is former. If it's within the past year, no. If it's over a year, yes, they could. An employee runs a small business, and her business partner rents units at a great rate to participants. I think we sort of covered that already, right? Yeah, business partner, no. Right, there's like a, right, you get the conflict there? What do you say? It's the subsidiary of the recipient AG owes the building, and an agency employee does the HQS, right? Yes? Yeah. All right. Okay. Sorry about these interactive things. They're not working the way we would like. Leases and occupancy agreements. Remember, if it is permanent housing, people have to have a one-year lease. That lease has got to be renewable on a month-to-month basis upon the completion of the lease. They've got to have a one-year lease in any permanent housing. If it is TH, the little TH that we have, we're gonna have some of these TH grant reduction programs coming in. They are required to have at least a month-to-month occupancy agreement. This is moving away from where we used to be. A lot of concepts into TH was sort of like at the discretion. You got to stay there at the discretion of the provider. HUD is really clear, it's due process. You've got occupancy rights. You can't just sort of say, no, you broke the rules, out you go. And you've got to have some really articulated use that occupancy rate. And of course, as we said, if it's tenant-based, definitely the lease is going to be between the property owner and your participant. So environmental reviews, you know, that is a requirement here. IHCDA, I believe, can work with you on the environmental reviews. They changed the requirement in the current NOFA. This was crazy, right? On every tenant-based unit, you had to have it's the easy form of environmental review, but you're required to do an environmental review on all units that you are assisting. They said in the 2017 NOFA that they're going to change it, and if it's a scatter site, leasing units in the community, then you're only going to have an environmental review on a project basis, not on a unit-by-unit basis. Where you're talking about those single site things, where you're doing permanent supportive housing in a single site building, that definitely requires an environmental review. It probably had as part of the initial development process, so that's fine, but those environmental reviews are only good for 5 years. So if you're doing it in a single site project, odds are, pay attention to when that environmental review is done, because it will have to be redone again in 5 years. Okay. How many comparable units required to send by rent response? This thing is so helpful. 3, yeah. Surprise. It just doesn't want this to happen. In one, you have to do a blood-based pen visual inspections. Okay, you get it, sorry. Not as useful as it could be. And now it's in the blackout. And one environmental review, when it was rebuilt, maybe we just talked about that. So it is every 5 years you have to do environmental review. Okay, other requirements. There's got to be something more. Okay, do any of you have subrecipients on your agreement? So when you do, there are some requirements that you have. If you've identified, you know, you're going to have a subrecipient because it's, you know, the first part of the application process that you do with HUD. It's like the second form is where you identify subrecipients. If you have identified subrecipients on that form, you've got to do these things. You actually are, the regulations require that you monitor that subrecipient at least annually if they're your subrecipient. You are required to make sure that subrecipient follows the program rules. HUD will monitor you, but you're expected to monitor your subrecipient. That means IHCDA has a lot of subrecipients here. You do monitor those. Yes, you are required to draw down your program funds at least quarterly. That is a requirement. We may ask that as part of the renewal evaluation process. That if we do ask that, that'll be a self-certification thing to indicate that we were doing that. You know, it's so much fun. I mean, working within the SAGE reporting system, but you are, if the system is up and operational, you're required to do it within 90 days of the end of your program year. I guess if the system is not operational, you do it as soon as they notify you that the system is operational and you can enter the data into it. And, you know, we're going to come back to this, but, you know, I think we're all in agreement that we want to fully expend the grants. And we'll talk about this because, you know, fully expending your grant means that you've got to monitor it. You can't, if you wait till month 10 of a 12-month grant to look at how much you've expended with that grant, there's no way you're going to be able to get it on track. So it really requires that you monitor your expenditures really on a regular basis, hopefully on a monthly basis, and identify when you are drawing down any month less than 1/12 of your grant, trying to understand why it is that's happening and see what you can do to increase your level of expenditure. You know, if you're using tenant-based rental assistance and the reason is you didn't have enough units on the lease, you weren't quickly getting units on the lease, you are allowed to over-lease, you know, and spend down funds by leasing more units than in your grant. You're allowed to do that. Would actually be expected to do that if that's a way to spend down the funds. Remember, we're going to get into it, but there are other ways you can spend your rental assistance dollars. If it's a rental assistance grant, you can do up to 2 months rent as a security deposit, things like that. I mean, consider, you know, spending down on purposes like that to make sure that we're drawing down, especially in the startup year of any grant, it's really difficult to spend those funds down in the course of a 12 month. If you're starting up, it's very hard in the course of a 12-month grant. So if it's a rental assistance thing, really look about giving those those security deposits and things like that, because it'll help you spend down the funds that you've got. Remember, you are allowed to charge staff costs to those rental assistance lines. Remember, the staff costs of administering rental assistance are chargeable to the rental assistance line. So you're doing, subsidy calculations, you've got a staff working on doing the income verification of folks and stuff like that. You've got a staff member going out doing the housing quality inspections, somebody's doing the lead-based paint inspection. All that stuff should be charged to the rental assistance budget line. Charge that to your admin.
Where's that written down? Where do we find that section that explains all those
Yeah.
different things that we,
I have no idea.
I didn't either. I wanna find that. Where's that?
Okay,
Is it in the rule? Like, is there?
it is in the interim rule. Would you just do me a favor, please? That one and the other question, just note that one down and send me an email. I will send you the site that says this. That's clearly the rule on this, and it can help. Because it gets, I'm going to get to the administrative costs too. Because remember, admin is different too. I mean, admin is not like, I take 7%. I bill about $100,000 and then I add 7% on top of that, and that's the end of the exercise. Admin is you can only bill them for eligible administrative costs up to the amount that's in your grant, which is, HUD plays around with that number. The Bureau just kind of incentivized you to keep it all below a number, and then they didn't. But whatever, it's whatever's in your budget for admin is what is in your budget for admin.
I have a question.
Yes.
We've got some open vouchers right now in Elkhart County, but our problem is housing stock. But we don't have that same problem in St. Joe County. Is there any way that we can transfer some of the Elkhart County money to the St. Joe County money so that we can use everything?
How does the grant work? Are those two separate grants? Is it a single grant that has two locations?
They're two separate grants.
Okay, then what we probably talk about, in the course of the year, you couldn't do it. We could do it through reallocation. We could do a reallocation of if you can't use it in the one county. What you could do as part of the competition is reallocate those dollars to the other county. And what you'd have to do is you'd have to do a new grant for those dollars that are being reallocated, and then you would consolidate it with that existing grant after it gets awarded by HUD. You would call that an expansion of the. You would reallocate it and call the new one an expansion of your existing grant, and then HUD would merge them together afterwards. So that is the way to get dollars out of an existing grant into another grant. No, that's not an amendment. Basically, we're going to do a permanent change to that grant. You can amend within. You can't amend outside of the confine of the walls of the grant. Basically, is what goes wrong. It's in that pot, and you can't go out of that pot anywhere than other than back to the Treasury, except for when we can play these little games in the competition. Both of those grants are coming to the same organization,
Yes.
and is the only difference that the county?
Yes.
Well, maybe we could consolidate it.
I was just gonna say that.
Another possibility would be to consolidate those two grants into a. Is there a reason why that can't happen?
No, we'd be happy to do that because it gives us a much more flexibility.
Absolutely, yeah. And then basically, you could, because you would. It sounds like you'd be in two fair market rent areas,
Yeah.
jurisdictions. That's fine. In the application process, you submit two different exhibits. One exhibit showing the fair market rent for Elkhart County, and the other one showing the fair market rent for the other county. It's perfectly fine. I don't see a reason why, especially if it's both permanent supportive housing.
Yep.
That would be, that grant. It's not an amendment; it's a grant consolidation, but it is something the field office can do. And in theory, this is something the field office would have an interest in doing because it reduces their workload, right? The fewer grant, there is a workload associated with everything that's got a grant number, and so therefore, if they have fewer grant numbers that they have to work with, it would reduce their workload. So in theory, they should be supported.
And that can only happen with the same program type, project type?
Yeah, exactly. So if it was rapid rehousing and permanent supportive housing, no, you could not. You couldn't, because a grant can only be for a single component at the same time.
Just to be clear, that consolidation would have to be done at application time.
No. You could approach the field office now. There are go ahead, Joe.
Well, I know Oaklawn has a couple of direct, don't you have a few direct grants with HUD? And then some with IHCDA, so as the subrecipient, is that right?
We had one in South Bend, in St. Joe County, but we changed that, so no longer South Bend.
Okay, well, we probably just need to look and see who about those fundings, but we could do that for you. If you want to talk about that, we can
Great.
do that after the training,
Yeah.
talk about it.
One thing you'll need to finagle a little with the field office is, one of the things that we want to do in the consolidation is not leave too much money behind when we're doing the thing. And the grants are going to have different end dates and stuff like that. And so there's just a little work that we try to do, that we consolidate them in a way that we don't, because basically one grant is going to disappear and anything that's remaining in that grant is going to, go back up to the treasury. So we want to do it in a way that we send as few dollars. So there's some strategic stuff we have to do about it, but I think that is going to be a long-term strategy to address that problem. This way you can adjust, things change in the future and as the ability to adjust.
It will, then we can go back.
Then go back, exactly. Exactly. My suggestion is, I think we take a little break now. I think some of you folks could use that. Come back in about 10 minutes, a little over 10 minutes at 2:30, and then, that's right, yeah, at 2:30, and then we'll be done by 4. So we kind of started with this stuff. So, grant amendments and changes could be your friends. It could be a way, as we were just talking about, a way, we want to spend down the grants. Maybe one of the reasons why we're having trouble spending down the grants is our budget is not designed in a way we can fully spend down that grant. So let's look at changing our budget so we can spend it down. If we end up with too many funds in our operating, leasing, or rental assistance budget line, and we keep talking about how hard it is to serve folks, let's put some of those dollars in the support services budget line to make sure that we can have some staff to it. Because as challenging as it is working with folks, we know that if we don't have staff and funds to pay for those staff, we're not going to accomplish much in the way of it all for the challenging folks that we're working with. So let's use this tool to help us spend our grants. So remember, there are two different kinds of grant amendments that you can make. You can make a significant amendment and a minor one. Significant are these things. If you change the recipient, if you stop being the grantee, that HUD considers that to be significant, no surprise. You can do that, by the way. A grant can go from one recipient organization to another. HUD is basically just going to ask you to document that the new organization getting that grant is at least as capable as the organization that it is replacing. And if you are, they'll approve it. And if you're not, they won't. But generally speaking, this happens not infrequently, that sometimes organizations go out of business and we have to transfer them to another grantee to take over. Sometimes they merge and things like that. Change happens in this world. If it is a single site project and you want to move the subsidy to another location, HUD considers that material. HUD is assessing where projects are located as to whether those are appropriate locations for homeless assistance projects, so they're going to want to accept the fact that that new site is appropriate. You have budget line items. So basically, if you say we no longer want to have supportive services in our project, that would be considered to be a significant change for the grant. If you want to, again, same thing. If you've only got rental assistance in your budget line, you're not spending down the grant, and you want to actually have a supportive services line to help you spend down that grant, that would be considered a significant change. HUD allows you, as a minor change, to move funds from one budget line to another as long as they do not exceed 10% of that budget line. And so if you have a supportive services budget that's $100,000, you could move up to $10,000 from another budget line into your supportive services budget line to supplement it. You do not need HUD permission to do that, but you must inform HUD that you made that change. The primary reason why you have to tell HUD about that is because they have to adjust the budget lines in the line of credit control system locks. And unless they adjust the budget lines when you go to draw down those funds, they're not going to draw down those funds because the budget that HUD has shows that you don't have money in that category. So think about those minor changes. As I'm saying, as you're expending month-to-month basis, if you're really having trouble expending one of those lines, and it's early in the grant term, think about going and doing either a minor or a significant change with the field office so that you can draw down those funds.
Just before break, you mentioned that we can use rental assistance funds to cover time spent doing quality inspection.
Yes.
What category would that be in on the grant?
Rental assistance.
That's just part of rental assistance, it's not a special subject.
Nope, it's the cost of administering, it's the cost of that rental assistance budget line. Remember, when you budget it to HUD, HUD is just going to base it on the fair market rent times the unit distribution, right? That's how that rental assistance budget line is determined. But that doesn't mean you spend it, because again, they're paying their 30% of income. So you sort of almost by definition end up, if your participants have any income whatsoever, of coming with sort of a surplus in that budget line. Therefore, we spend it, we spend it down from staff. We get this right, so therefore, if it's allowable to charge staff time on HQS and stuff like that, it'll help us spend down the totality of that budget line. Also, those other things, hopefully I'll have that thing to remember. You can also charge, as I said, rental assistance could be a security deposit. You can also, we talked about this before, after they left the unit, you can have up to a month's worth for damages that were caused in that unit, but that's only post when your participant has left. Yes, and if you use HUD, really, HUD feels that they have bought a certain number of units serving a certain kind of population type, so they think they're buying two things. They're buying these number of units of housing assistance and this kind of population that has these kinds of needs, and they see that they're coming together, and that's how they have approved a single budget. So therefore, if you're either reducing the number of folks that you're serving, changing that number, or changing the characteristics, by going from a seriously mentally ill to physically disabled population, something like that. That is going to say, that's a significant change. We're going to have to approve that because we recognize that there was a need for this other system. It's not going to do what I know. Oh, maybe it will. Yeah, okay. So if it's a significant change, we do believe, because we are not, although you do have independent grants with HUD, the continuum care is part of this process as well. The continuum care should be notified if you want to make a significant change with HUD, and it should be reviewed with the COC to make sure that it all makes sense, we all stay on the same page together on this. Then when you've done it, basically provide a detailed request of the thing and send it into the field office. And remember, obviously, no change happens until the field office has approved that change.
They actually, we did one, and they actually required a letter from the COC to say they approved it too.
Good. That's a good thing. And so this is a minor change, as I said. All you have to do is document it, make sure you stay, and make sure that the field office is notified, and that you've told them that it's a minor change that you've made to the grant. What concurs the grant if it's not concurrent? That's what I'm trying to. Yes. Okay. Obviously, you can't change from leasing to rent. That's a major change in program components. That's a change in the grant. Transfer the subrecipient is. We do some spending by moving unspent funds to supported services. It depends exactly. What is it doing to? Yeah, it doesn't like this concept. Okay. Yeah, so this is very clear. You can't, if you are permanent supportive housing, there's no way, the only way you can change that grant to rapid rehousing is reallocate it in the application process. You can't just change, you can't go from transitional housing to permanent supportive housing as a grant. That's a completely new project as far as that's concerned. Okay, so we hit this before. This is things we didn't necessarily like. So if it is you, if you are the one who is directly receiving the HUD funds, remember the landlord is, if you're dealing with a third-party property owner, they are not directly receiving the HUD funds. But if it is you are the recipient of the HUD funds and leasing those housing to folks, then you hit you run into this prohibition on fees. We're going to get you the look. There's actually a citation here, which is helpful because you want that program fee citation. So first off, the thing in the interim rule is going to be found in 578 is the COC regulations. So it's 87D of 587D is going to give you the thing that says there are no program fees. That's all it's going to say. You can't charge program fees. That's may not be clear what exactly they're saying there. HUD has got these various different ways of making their wishes known. Obviously, the regulations the regulations have the force of law, basically. You know, the regulations are basically interpreting the statute and say how the funds can be spent. They're really, you know, it's heavily regulated how the government regulates. And so therefore HUD has come up with all these kind of non-regulation things to basically give you guidance and policy. And one of the things they use are these frequently asked questions things that tell you this. So here is a HUD posted frequently asked questions. It's got a question ID of 751.71. It is going to go into further detail and tell you about all these things that you're not able to charge participants. So again, you know, third-party landlord who's not directly receiving the HUD funds, they do what they do according to, you know, landlord-tenant law in the state of Indiana. Whatever they're allowed to do, they're allowed to do. You as a recipient of HUD funds are restricted. You can't charge these things, the late fees, the lost keep, so, is that what you teach people to charge, whatever the fees and things like that? But we can't, legal fees, yep. Again, you can't ask people to pay security deposits to you for that program. Obviously, the program you as a grantee are allowed to get security deposits from. Yeah, damages fees, things, same like you can. That damn AAQ says specifically you can't do that.
I have a question. Joe Closure. We charge security deposits.
Okay, let's just say, you know, whenever we do something like this, this is always a safe zone. Let me talk about it for just a second. This is always a safe zone. We would never do that. You can ask whatever questions you want. We'd never turn, you know, in a thing like this, questions and say, aha, right, Joe? I mean, so please don't worry. This is always a safe zone. We want people to know the information.
So we have a permanent supportive housing grant, and it's a grant that is a rental assistance. It gives us operation money
That's
and
good.
service money.
Yep.
But we've charged security deposits, we've charged for lost keys, and we've been monitored and either they've never caught it or. So we're confused.
Yeah, they tend to treat rental assistance and leasing a little different than operations, and they're probably not going to monitor that as carefully on the operating side. So what are you doing? So basically, you enter into occupancy agreements with this. You give them a 1 year.
Lease.
Yep. Uh-huh.
That 1 year lease.
Yep.
And it's like our leases and our other facilities.
Yep.
Because, you know, again, you know, you got fair housing at play here. So if you charge one tenant for a lost
True.
key, you don't
Yep.
charge another.
Yep. I think because you're under operations, you can do that.
Okay.
It's the rental assistance and leasing folks that
Okay.
are restricted in terms of what they can do.
Okay, so it's rental assistance and
Yep.
leasing,
Yeah.
which makes no sense either, because I thought you just said that. Oh, I see, okay, never mind. Too much information.
It is. It is. Okay, so here's some of these things about. Oh, go ahead.
I have a question about if somebody comes in with a companion animal.
I'm sorry?
A companion animal, we can't.
Oh, yeah.
charge,
Yep.
You know, because a typical apartment complex would charge a pet deposit. We can't even do that for companion animals.
No. No, I think under those circumstances, yes. If we're talking, remember, and you very clearly indicated that what we're talking about is a companion animal, is a pet.
And I've been told they're not considered pets if it's a service or companion.
Okay, so that same little furry thing that we all love can be one of three things. That wonderful little creature could be your pet, which means they're my child, children, and you know, and they're a member of the family, as the dog food companies will have you believe. But you know, in which case, if they're a pet, yes, you can charge a pet fee for it, and you can have reasonable limitations on pets in order to ensure safety and things like that. Then there are emotional support animals and service animals, and HUD actually, and I'll get some slides on it, HUD actually really recognizes both service animals and emotional support animals, and there's a distinction. A service animal performs a specific task for a person with disabilities. An emotional support animal alleviates one or more symptoms of an existing underlying disability. So once you, and generally speaking, it can be required that you have some medical certification that the animal is either a service animal or an emotional support animal. HUD is, there are a lot of places that like to try and somehow make a hard and fast line between service and emotional support. HUD doesn't really recognize that. HUD recognizes both emotional support and service animals pretty much equally, as long as you've got documentation that support that animal being there. And once you've got that, emotional support and service animals are not pets. And so therefore they're not going to be subject, they should not be subject to pet fees because they're not a pet. And sometimes you do, it gets to be a gray area, right? It's insurance becomes the issue, when the pit bull becomes the emotional support animal, and when you've legitimately got a landlord who's got an insurer has got unacceptable breeds and stuff like that, there can be some real human issues there, and it's a real tough one. They are going to have a right to an animal. The landlord is going to have some right to have some say over the animal. If it's a service animal, generally speaking, in order for that animal to be able to perform that task, they're going to be really trained, and the service animals are hugely expensive. And I'm sorry? It's emotional support where it becomes the gray.
Emotional support animals aren't trained like service.
So that's where you want to get that's where you really need the medical documentation on the emotional support. The medical documentation has really got to speak to alleviating symptoms of an existing disability. And if you can get that documentation on the emotional support animal, then they should be, HUD, and I'll have a link to it, but HUD's Fair Housing and Equal Opportunity has really issued some guidance that they have to be recognized and allowed. As I said, there could be this gray, weight and stuff like that in some things. You may have to do some negotiating around that, because in some cases the landlords have a legitimate. It happened to me. I had a dog who was had a pit lab. Sweetest dog in my life. My home insurer came in to do an inspection and said, didn't tell us in my face, of course, because he wouldn't have gotten out of there alive. But next thing I got a letter from the insurance company, you got an unacceptable breed. You got an unacceptable something else. It's like, who could have that job? We go to somebody's house and say, you gotta get a job. There's a place in hell for those people. Sorry, I don't mean to bring my personal life too much into this thing. But it is.
We just want to know us three here. Where did you get to keep your dog?
Of course. Are you kidding? No, I changed carrier. First, I was lucky. That happens, right? There's some markets where there's one carrier and you're dead. I was lucky there was another carrier in the market, so I could change carriers. I don't know what wrong. No, of course not. Take my right arm. Okay, so I talked to a couple of these things. So what you can pay for under rental assistance, so we talked about the security deposit. And again, startup, really use those 2 months to try and, help spend down the contract. Remember this, and we sort of talked about this before, but if you have somebody in the unit, they leave. So here it is, February, it's January 18th. And so, I'm leaving today. So rent for January has already been paid, so that's over. You can also pay, even though I've left the unit, you can pay in February. But as of March 1st, you can no longer pay on that unit. So if, for example, by holding on to that unit, you could then maybe get the landlord to accept somebody else coming into the unit, or you own it, it's your single site building, in which case you very much want to get that month's rent. You could do it. So you can get the month that they left in and 1 month afterwards, but after that, forget about it. Unless you've got an eligible participant in that unit, you can no longer charge for it, but you can do those extra 30 days. So again, we've got a lot of single site projects here to make sure that you get those extra 30 days for you. As we said before, if you have got a situation where it's a dedicated chronic homeless unit, something like that, in order to occupy that unit, you need a qualifying individual, as is somebody who meets the disability definition and chronic homeless definition. In that case, and you've got other family members, but you do not have a qualifying individual, or we talked about before, where somebody formed a relationship, and your client is gone, but his partner, or he or she is still in the unit, but they're not disabled or something like that. They can remain in the unit for as long as the lease runs, and then at completion of the lease, they have to go. So if they had, if it's, again, month 2 of the lease, they get 10 months of assistance. If it's month 11, they get very limited assistance. Yeah.
That security deposit up to 2 months, I have tried to sell a couple of my landlords on that idea because, it's just really nice to have.
Yeah.
They've always turned me down because they say, well, I don't charge the other tenants in my building 2 months deposit, and HUD won't let me get away with that. Is there a counter to that argument?
And they're saying HUD will get me on a fair housing thing.
Yeah. In fact, I'm paying less than 1 month deposit because they're charging less than 1 month deposit, and I'm really, for me, it's better if they did double the deposit full month so that when I have move out damages, I still have a landlord to work with.
Yeah, exactly. I don't think I can solve that. I think that is that legitimate concern. You have to treat people with, and you can't treat them differently because of the subsidy thing. I think that exactly. And of course, again, the utility costs, again, up the utility allowance, even though, again, because that plus the reasonable rent that you're about the fair market rent, you can pay up to that amount of utility cost.
For the rent for damages,
Yes.
what kind of documentation would we need from the landlord? What all would I have to have? Just an invoice, something from them?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, clearly, you will have done your HQS, so you will have had some sense as to what the unit looked like beforehand. So you could, you will have some starting baseline, if you will, and therefore their invoice to show what it is that they had to pay to.
So even if the bill is for 2,000, I can pay up to 1 month's of rent from.
Yeah, from these grant funds.
Yeah.
Exactly. You can't pay. You may have other sources of money.
The landlord is, according to Indiana law, supposed to issue a 45-day letter, a letter in 45 days upon someone's move out of damages that's incurred, and you can use that.
But that goes to the tenant,
Yes, but he could copy you on it.
the landlord.
The landlord.
By the way, in rental assistance, we do recommend, it's always great practice to, if you're dealing with a third-party landlord, to have an agreement between you and the landlord about this payment of rental assistance so that they will notice you and stuff like that, and not commence eviction proceedings without notifying you and stuff like that. I think, why not add that to the, that they must copy you with that.
And just for clarification, the rent for 30 days post-participant move out, is that if they move out before the lease is done? Or if my 12-month lease is done, I don't intend to stay in this unit?
Yeah, no, that'd be for,
Okay.
it's while the lease would still be in effect.
Okay. I assume that, but just wanted to clarify.
Can you do the rent for 30 days post move out and the 1 month rent for damages?
Yes, yeah, because it's totally separate cost things that we're talking. HUD's got these concepts of double dipping, and basically when the HUD gets into double dipping, they talk about time periods and cost type. And so you can't pay the same cost type for the same time period. So that's why they would say, you can't combine rental assistance with any kind of operating with any other kind of subsidy that pays for the daily cost of occupying that unit, because that's going to be a double dip. But, we've got a thing that's covering the occupancy cost, and we've got a separate thing that's not about the occupancy cost at all, it's about damages. So those are different cost types, so that's not a double dip, and that's why you need to know how to do it.
Would it raise a flag if we started doing this now, but we didn't previously this year? Okay.
I think HUD recognizes that people can learn.
Okay.
And so, you have, you got information on thought you think you could do.
It's the best thing I learned all day.
If a resident passes away and doesn't just move out,
And there's no other family members.
Yes, we were told that the subsidy stops right then. We can't do it past the 30 days. Is that still the case?
No. No, I think you can continue even, you paid that month, you can pay that 30, or are you saying after the 30 days, or, so it's the completion of the month and you can pay the next
If a
month.
resident passed away at the beginning of the month, we were told in the past that if
You
it's
can do the next
dead,
month.
that we can't continue to collect the subsidy for 30 days, it stops.
No, you can do that 30-day period of time, because it is to give you that period of time to refresh. And this final thing, and again, we'll get the citation, but this administrative cost of rental assistance, that's what we're talking, that's what, again, the negotiations with landlords, the HQS, the subsidy determination, the getting the third-party verification of the, God, whatever you need to get disability,
Writing all the checks.
of course, processing the payments, of course. But, I mean, I don't know, sending somebody to medical school or something so they can do your disability determinations from now on, which is not a rental assistance. I take that back. Do not charge medical school expenses to the rental assistance line. They will not. They will not allow you to do that. Leasing. Okay. All right. Yeah, I think we got guidance, and that's why we changed the slide about the leasing thing. I think that HUD changed their mind because this question came up. What do we do about if we're leasing? Can we use the leasing line to pay for those administrative costs? So that we got conflicting guidance, but then we got reaffirmed guidance from HUD. So you can pay for the administrative costs of leasing under the leasing line.
Thumbs up.
Yeah, we did get them. So again, that's going to be more reasonable. It's going to be processing and rent checks, all that sort of stuff. There is real staff time associated with that.
Yeah.
They don't have that additional, that additional month's rent for damages in leasing that we have in rental assistance. They don't make it easy for folks the way they have things that you can do under one, and it's the same damn program. It's just so utilities again are obviously, if utilities are included in the rent under leasing or rental assistance, you can pay for them under the rent as long as the rent is reasonable. That's not a problem. If it's leasing, this came up. So if the rent is not included, I think this came up and this is answering the question we had before. So if the rent is not, if the utilities are not included in the rent and you're paying for it, it's going to be an operating cost in leasing. So that is a difference there.
So it would be an operating cost.
Yep. And so utility rental assistance is based on the utility allowance. It's not included in the lease. And there are some supported services only projects, and if you have a supported services only project, then you can cover the utility costs of that supported services project in the supported services budget line. It's only in supported services only projects. We had some operating costs here. Remember, that's the other way you can pay for housing costs in the new care program. You can do rental assistance, leasing, or operating costs. So basically, it covers the day-to-day physical operation, anything you can charge as maintenance and repair. There is this limitation on building security. If you've got operating funding in your project and less than half of the units in the building are covered in the grant, you can't charge security to it. That's specifically in the regulations, so be careful about that one. I see this on applications sometimes, where people will have that security cost line in there, and it's very clear that over 50% of the units in the unit are not, it's only covering like 10 units out of a 60-unit building, something like that. So in those circumstances, for whatever reason, HUD does not let you pay for the security. Again, they consider utilities to be an operating cost here. Furniture, some of these things, those of you who've been around this program, because they changed all these regulations about 3 years ago when we went from the supportive housing program, the Shelter Plus Care, to the Continuum Care program. And when the regulations changed, some things that had been operating became supportive services, and some things that were supportive services became operating. It was a real nuisance for a period of time until the budgets got changed. And some of these things, especially stuff like furniture, used to be a supportive services cost, switched over to operating. It is confusing a little historically, though. But this is an issue because, like in rental assistance, for example, you do have an extra burden of coming up with dollars, as you know, to get those units furnished correctly. That's a problem, and unless, and you can't pay for it out of the COC grant because of the climbing funds, which I'll get to in just a second. So that could be matching funds, of course, that you use to pay for that, but it is an issue and a concern. Okay, and so some things. There are some of these unallowable combination of operating funds. You can't combine rental assistance and operating funds in the same unit or structure. So therefore, as I said, operations can pay for furniture. That means if you've got rental assistance on the unit, you can't use operating funds to pay for furniture in that rental assistance unit that you're combining in the same unit. That is something that HUD looks for. And obviously, if the lease says that the landlord is responsible for maintenance and repair, then HUD does not want to pay for it out of their operating cost line. So it's otherwise the responsibility of another party. HUD is not going to pay for it. Food is one of those, is the opposite of furniture. Food went from operations to supportive services, so you have to pay for it out of supportive services. We clear about operating in this double dipping stuff? HUD is strict on this. Review. Oh, it's not a word. How long can you pay rent when someone is incarcerated? So it's going to depend. So if they're the only person, if they were the only person in the unit, it's going to be, and they're incarcerated, we can pay for like the remainder of the month and the 30 days afterwards, right? If they are, if the incarcerated person was not the only member of the household, but was the qualifying member. Yeah, they're going to be, they'll be in for a year. Yeah. In that case, what we do if they're the qualifying member, but there are other household members, to the end of the lease, yeah, we keep assisting them then. Well, yeah, there it says the same thing. It's going to say 2 months rent.
9 days.
Yeah.
That's 89 days.
It's 90 days, but on the 89th day, if they're not out,
Yeah.
and then the next day is your 90 days.
Yeah.
That's not mid-month. I mean, if they went to jail today on January 18th, then they
Yeah.
have 89 days that we can continue to pay the rent.
Yes. That's where they're allowable absence from the unit. And that's across the board. So in this program, they've limited to 90 days, which you can do. Anyhow, incarceration, which is not considered a desirable thing for our participants, but hospitalization, which happens. Yes, it does happen. Hospitalization, any of those things, they can be absent from the unit, but there is a limitation. Because basically, I was going to say, they sort of, then once they're institutionalized for 90 days, we've got a change in their homeless status. Okay, supportive services. One thing I want to say, didn't say this before, the way they wrote these regulations, HUD basically says, we either specifically allow it or it's not allowed. So unless something is specifically allowed in the regulations, not for anything, unless you can literally say, the regulations say you can pay for it, generally the assumption is if it isn't specifically called out, it is not an allowable expense. So that is important. So therefore, these are the only expenses that you can pay for under supportive services. As I told you, there is that requirement that you do that annual assessment of service needs. So I'd recognize that as a specific supportive service need. There are limitations on many of these things, like moving, for example. It talks about reasonable moving expense costs and reasonable short-term storage costs. Obviously, when we're talking about mental health, outpatient health, substance abuse treatment stuff, what we're saying is we're going to use the continuum. You can use continuum of care funds for these, but we want to use those as the last resort. If there are other mainstream resources, if there's Medicaid, there's something else to pay for it, you're not going to use the continuum of care funds to pay for that. Certain other items like legal services, there are additional limitations as to what it is that you can use it for. So if you're thinking about using any, it really pays on your supportive services, whatever you've got as a budget line, it really pays to go into the regulations under supportive services and read specifically what HUD says is the allowable thing. It goes into some detail, but they will, for many of these things, they have additional limitations. For example, transportation. Transportation is really supposed to be just as part of people going to school or to work. You're really not supposed to provide transportation for recreational services. Under transportation, the sweet thing in these regulations, you can actually pay for the repair of a privately owned vehicle. This is a great thing because, those of our participants who are lucky enough to have a vehicle have got a greater opportunity for employment, 100-fold, right, or whatever. But sometimes, the difference between them being able to maintain their employment and not being able to maintain their employment is that clunker can get them to and fro the workplace. So, in the event that you are located in a place where there's not adequate public transportation, is that imagine? And the cost of the repair is less than 10% of the Blue Book value of the vehicle, you can do it for your clients. So again, you know, not every client is that going to make sense for, but you know, there certainly are those examples where that can be the difference between your client being able to keep their employment and get more independent and go entirely in the wrong direction. So, but we need to keep that going on. So, any questions about allowable supportive services? Like I said, I'll just say it again. You know, look at your budget. Anything that you call in your budget for spending under supportive services, take a look at what the actual regulations say for that activity and make sure that you're in compliance with that. So this is something that sometimes trips people up, this gift card thing. Because I remember I said food is an eligible supportive service expense, and food is an eligible supportive service expense, but you know, how you get food assistance to people is a challenge sometimes, and what people have done is getting a gift card at you know, Sam's Club or whatever and stuff like that makes a certain amount of sense. The problem is gift cards are easily fungible. I mean, you take that gift card and you can turn it into cash, you know, in a heartbeat. And in which case HUD says the one thing you can't ever do is give cash to your participants. So it's very clear you can't do the gift card thing. You know, what you could potentially do, I mean, you could have a staff member go with your participant with the food card, and your staff member could pay for groceries with that gift card. You just can't give a gift card to people. Oh, shoot, that's me. Stop. Okay, so I told you know, oh, you know what, the other thing is, which is really cool here because we don't give our MSWs any authority, but on top of that, they cannot, you know, so obviously, you know, once you're licensed by law, you've got continuing education requirements and stuff like that to maintain your licensure. What does it mean? They say, you know, if you are professionally licensed, it's kind of your personal responsibility to maintain your professional licensure, and HUD means that they are, don't pay for that. Don't pay for that. Which is really cool. By the way, the VA does. They provide training to their licensed staff, and that training they provide to their licensed staff meets their continuing education requirements. Sorry guys, change agencies. What was this? Oh, okay. Yeah. So as we said, you know, if for any instance, if you had it set up that you had scattered site units, but you had a supportive services staff that were located in an office that was separate from all of those, the cost of that office space for your supportive services cost is an eligible expense under your supportive services budget. And when you do your annual budget to HUD and you're in the supportive services exhibit, you're going to see line by line by line each one of those eligible expense categories that I have on the slide. And then the bottom line is going to say something like operating costs. And that's where you put those dollars in that budget. What is this talking about? Can it pay for recreational activities? No, never. So, that's the other thing about the feds, right? Anything that is called entertainment is forbidden. You can never use federal funds for entertainment. Can you use a gift card? No. Can COC rental assistance projects pay for participant utility deposits? Utility deposits are supportive service costs, so it's going to go back to a stupid thing. So it says you can either use program income or matching funds to pay for those deposits. That's not an eligible cost under the rental assistance, right? Because again, the rental assistance is not talking about utility deposits or a supportive service cost. If you had that under your supportive services budget, yes, but they put it into another budget line there. We're going to talk a little bit about program income in a moment. Remember, if you receive tenant rent payments directly to your agency, like certainly when you've got a single site project where you own the building and people are paying their rent directly to you, that is considered to be program income that you're receiving from those participants, right? And therefore, you can spend, first of all, no, you can't. You must spend your program income. You're expected to spend program income in the year in which you generate it. I've run into folks who took all those tenant rental payments that they get annually and they put it all into a reserve fund because they thought they could save it there, and in case there was a problem somewhere along the line, they could spend it on that. You can't do that. Program income is required to be received and expended by the agency, number one, and number two, you can only expend it on things that are eligible under the regulations. It doesn't have to be in your budget. So, for example, you talked about this example of utility deposits. You do not necessarily have to have a supportive services budget line that would cover those utility deposits. It just has to be something that is eligible under the regulations. Then you can spend your program income on it, regardless as to whether or not it's included in your program budget or whether you even have that activity in your contract. Is that clear? Okay, this I sort of alluded to this, but you know, a lot of you can have an administrative fee that's somewhere along 7%. Now HUD allows it to be up to 10%, so new grants could be up to 10% HUD. Jill and I joked about this before. HUD had this on-again policy where you got bonus, the COC would get bonus points if nobody asked for more than 7%, so they kind of forced everybody to low. And then HUD forgot about that a year later and was like, well, it was like the most important thing under the sun. It's like, oh, who cares? So, regardless of whether it's 7% or 10%, the problem is it got people into thinking that they kind of just earned it by spending the other dollars, and then, you know, I spent $100,000, so therefore I've earned $7,000 in administrative fees, so I'm going to collect it. No. Administrative fees are only for allowable administrative expenses. This is the list of allowable administrative expenses: budgets and schedules, monitoring, compliance with the grants, agreements, you know, doing your HUD does not pay you to apply for funds, so don't say that application, the renewal application is something I'm charging them. You're not supposed to charge them to pay for applying for their funds, but certainly you can charge them for completing the annual performance report and all the funding you have working in the SAFE system. That is an allowable expense for you to do. You know, by the way, they have, you know, all the O&B requirements remain in effect as these are federal dollars. There is that single audit requirement, sort of the A133 audit we used to audit. That is an important and expensive audit. The cost, you know, the reasonable share for your program of preparing that audit is certainly an allowable administrative expense that's going outside to a third-party vendor there. Certainly, if you're want to do any kind of program evaluation or analysis, that is allowable as an administrative expense. And basically, you know, whatever, you know, the upkeep of your administrative offices, you know, if there's rent, utilities, you know, and insurance costs like that of having your administrative facility. But remember, HUD is going to therefore look for you to be charging your, and basically you're going to be, if you're billing HUD for admin, you're supposed to have some backup that shows what we spent those admin dollars for on which one of these eligible administrative activities. So you can't just send an invoice to HUD for $8,000 of administrative fee. You're going to have some backup in your agency, which HUD is going to look at as to how those $8,000 were spent, and the $8,000 are going to have to be spent on one of these activities. And again, if it's staff that are doing, you know, you're paying your own staff to do APR work or stuff like that, that means, you know, we need to have some time records that show that, you know, Sally spent, you know, 190 hours doing the APR.
Welcome to SAFE.
In the course of the month of January. Whatever reason, HUD put the environmental review as an administrative, I have no idea why, but they did it. So environmental review is specifically considered to be an admin expense, and that is how you pay for that. If you have, I don't know, does IHCDA share the admin fee with sub-recipients?
Yes.
You know, you have such a nice agency. I was just doing this in New York City, by the way, where you got the City's Department of Housing Preservation and Development. Now, we don't give them any admin money. Don't tell them they have rent cap. It's like, okay, you know you have to. We don't do that. It's the City of New York. They can afford the legal fees. Fortunately, IHCDA follows the rules.
It's like 3.5%. Although it's interesting because not everybody is taking their admin money. So when we get to the next round, you probably want to look at your budgets a little closer. And I'm sure based on things that Howard's saying, you may want to just look at that again. See if you've got money. Because a couple of agencies, I'm pretty sure, do not have admin money. I don't know why, so maybe there's a reason, but just something to think about.
I have heard people say it's not worth it. The paperwork, the record keeping and stuff like that, it's just, you know. we just assume not have to hassle with it. I have heard folks say that, but whatever. You're not required to do it, but if you do collect admin fees, obviously you've got to follow the regulations on what's allowable. You know, I don't need to go into much in this. This is getting a little bit, but you understand, sometimes people have confusion between indirect costs and admin costs. They really are different things. A lot of times people kind of conflate the two. They really are different. So as we indicated before, admin costs are very, very specific. There's a very specific cost category, and we can identify what those costs are. Indirect costs are basically general agency stuff that we can't allocate to a specific cost center within the agency. So, you know, if you had a fundraising thing, sometimes HR, sometimes IT, you know, those are general agency functions that are really hard to break out the costs and apply it towards each function. And what you do instead is you total what those overall administrative costs, indirect costs are for your agency, and you get a approved indirect cost rate from a federal agency. HUD, in the early years of this program, HUD was not at all clear as to whether or not they would recognize those federal indirect cost rates. Now in these regulations, they're very clear. If you have an approved indirect cost rate, which has to be approved by what they call a cognizant federal agency, so it's got to be the federal agency that you do the bulk of your work with. This is something your accountants do, by the way. Don't think you're going to go home and prepare a request for an indirect cost rate. But if you do have an approved indirect cost rate, you are allowed to charge that indirect cost rate to each one of the budget lines that you have in your HUD grant. Now, remember, HUD does not increase the size of your grant. Other than, you know, we saw some changes based on the increase in the fair market rent. You know, permanent housing gets a bump up as the fair market rent goes, costs go up. But you certainly are not going to, you know, you're not seeing regular bumps up in your contract or anything like that. Where am I going with that? What I'm going is that if you've got set budget lines, you can't increase your budget lines because you have an indirect cost rate. So if your contract with HUD is for $250,000 and your indirect cost rate is 20%, you can't all of a sudden charge HUD $300,000 for it. You're still limited to that same $250,000, but what you could do, if you could, is you could, you know, basically go back into your budget and take that indirect cost rate and you know, leave the remaining, if it's 20%, leave the remaining 80% for the direct costs of that line. You certainly are allowed to do that. And when you apply for a new grant, you know, when you apply for, if you've got an indirect cost rate, then you probably want to add that indirect cost rate to what it is you're applying for under a new grant. HUD also, and this is, guys will really glaze over, but HUD also, and they basically, you know, you probably know there were these OMB circulars, the A133, the A87, A122, A1 steak sauce. They combine them all together into what they call the super circular, 2 CFR Part 200. Why did I go there? Under that they created a new thing. What they did is they established what they call a de minimis indirect cost rate. So basically you all are, even if you do not have an approved indirect cost rate, you are eligible for a 10% de minimis indirect cost rate. Again, you can't add, if it's an existing grant, you can't increase your budget by 10% to get that de minimis indirect cost rate, but you could. You know, if you had room in your budget, or same thing in rental assistance that we're having trouble spending. If you had an indirect cost rate, you could apply towards your rental assistance budget line and spend down that as well. Or if you don't have room, you could charge the de minimis 10% indirect cost rate to help spend down your grant budget as well. Again, if you're applying for a new one, and hopefully, you know, we got new grants funded this year, 4 new grants funded, hopefully we'll get new grants funded in the 2018 competition. So if you're applying for a new grant, you know, I mean, the sky is not the limit because, you know, there's going to be a specified number of dollars that we're allowed to apply for in the competition. But, you know, within the dollars that you can apply for, you know, back out funds to cover the indirect costs of your operation. No one benefits if your organization goes broke. And, you know, if we can find ways to cover the costs of your operations, you can help.
Fantastic.
Okay. Oh, good. So I've talked about all this stuff. So we'll keep going here. And match, we're doing good. We're doing good. So you know, match, as I said, it's late in the day, but match is so important. Like I said, if you do not meet that match, HUD is heartless, unforgiving, and cruel, and will demand that you pay them the match that you have not met. They will absolutely demand it. As I said, If you're using a cash match, you can pay for anything that is eligible under the regulations. It does not have to be in your budget, it does not have to be in your scope. As long as it is somewhere listed in the regulations, you can spend your matching funds. Yet, if it's cash, you expect, the only time it's going to qualify as match is if the organization has received it and spent it. Then, HUD is going to ask you to show evidence that you've actually spent out that you received it and you spent out the cash match during the course of that program year. Sometimes, and this is where we try to catch this, HUD, now the application will tell you automatically what the minimum match is when you're doing that application. If you don't have that minimum match, a red thing is going to pop up saying you haven't met the minimum match is blah, blah, blah. But HUD will say nothing if your minimum 25% match is $25,000 and instead you put in $125,000, HUD is not going to, there's no red flag, HUD is not going to say anything about that. They're going to say, okay, whatever reason this person decided they wanted to commit $125,000 towards this. Be careful though, because they can monitor on that and they can have a finding that you didn't meet the match that you pledged under the thing. So matching more than the 25% sounds like, you're really doing extra credit and, you should get special recognition from HUD. You don't. What you do get is additional risk. So there's nothing, if you've got those resources you can spend on your clients, God bless you, spend them on the clients. Just don't commit to HUD that you're going to do it, because maybe you won't have them. And then HUD can come back to you and say, you didn't meet, you pledged, it's a contract. You said you were going to provide this money, we said we're going to provide that money, where's your share? Sometimes, since it's above the legally required match, you might be able to argue them to only make you liable for the legally required match. But why put yourself in that? There really is nothing. There was a time, remember that leveraging? Please. Please. I tell you, it was the most insane thing under the sun, and we made people do such bad.
20% leverage, oh my God.
And what the hell did it ever mean?
Nothing.
And what, nothing. Well, I mean, Norm Suchar, who's the head of the SNAPS division, actually is a really, really smart guy. And basically we said, what the hell were we doing that for? And said we don't do it anymore. So that got people confused, because there was this incentive to come up with this gazunta match. And people went crazy doing it, and it made people think that they should do that with the match too. So no, there was a crazy concept that they had. They abandoned the crazy concept, let not the craziness continue. I have seen, maybe even here, I can't recall, sometimes, because the value of real estate can be applied towards match, but I've seen people apply that same BoSCoC to building year after year after. You can't do that. I mean, if you're talking about the value of the property, it just works once. You have to come up with other sources of match. You can't match year after year after year after year after year, ad infinitum. It's not going to happen that way. As I said, they did, when they first came up with these regulations, they said if you're getting rental income from your participants and they go into your bank account, that was always program income. HUD used to say that couldn't count towards match, that they changed their mind. And now that does count towards match, and that's great, because that can really go long ways to meet that match requirement, and it's in cash, and it really simplifies the process a lot. Match can be a real bear for a lot of folks. Is that you folks you're able to meet your matches? Good. Okay. But here's the thing, we know some folks are doing in-kind matches, and there are additional requirements to do an in-kind match. So first off, you know that at the front end, you've got to document an in-kind match with a memorandum of understanding. That is why, if the source of the matching funds is within your organization, it could never be an in-kind match. You could never enter into an MOU with yourself, right? I mean, it takes two parties to enter into an agreement. They've got to be legally distinct, separate parties. So the only way, it's highly, highly, highly unlikely, if not impossible, if you are providing the funds for the match, for it to be an in-kind match. It's going to be a cash match. If the funds are coming to your agency from some other grant or something like that, that's all a cash match coming in. It's only when it's coming by a third-party agency that you're going to be talking about in-kind match. And when it is in-kind match, it needs this MOU. The MOU has got to cover all of these things. It's got to talk about the specific service, it's got to cost about the rate for providing that service. So again, if we're talking about an outpatient mental health clinic and they've got established rates for either group counseling, individual counseling, medication management, for whatever services they provide, basically they're going to say, you know, our medication management visit is billed at $100 a visit, and you know, your client had 12 monthly medication management visits. 12 times $100 is our in-kind match. You have to document all of that. You should also, you know, since it's coming like that, you know, it's the profession is going to be, you know, either social, you know, licensed social worker or something like that, is the person who's providing those matching services. Yep. So again, you can do goods, property, and equipment. You know, sometimes somebody will donate food. Sometimes there can be food donated to your project and stuff like that. That could count as the match. It could be an in-kind match, and that could be in goods. Again, that upfront letter has got to always be gated. It's got to be linked to a specific operating year, and it's got to show what that donation is going to be used for. Okay. So what else was I going to say about the in-kind thing? Yeah, so what we didn't capture on this slide, which is important, is at the end of the year, you're going to have to come up some documentation that those services were all actually received by the clients, and that totals back to what it is that the original match requirement was. Is that clear? This match is really important. Okay, guess what? I think the next one is the last slide. That's even a half an hour earlier than I hadn't done this with you also. I didn't know exactly how I was going to do it. Is that okay? You know, I feel I haven't told you enough about my childhood. Because that's why they are much more interested in my childhood. And theirs is better than mine, too. Okay. Look, you have to maintain records of your grant for 5 years following the completion of the contract. So it's, you know, so if your contract end date is, you know, 1/31/18, then you're going to maintain the records associated with that grant until, you know, 2/1/23, I guess is 5 years. So again, you know, so you have to hold on to those records for 5 years. And basically, you know, you can keep your specific charts as in an archive them. But you want to keep your specific charts intact. You want to show that you've got documentation of the services, you know, that the unit met housing quality standards, you had that all along, that you met the match, that they were eligible, and that you did your income determinations and all this. So basically, keep your charts for 5 years after the end of the grant term under which they were assisted. So it could be, you could purge some of the, you know, you'll probably end up paying storage fees. For some record retentions, but you know, you have to maintain it. I think that's going to do it. So, any questions on stuff that hasn't been covered? Will you? I think there are a couple of open items. Will you please send me those open items so I can make sure to get back to you on those things? I'm sorry that I did not track that.
And you will be emailing this out?
Yes.
Great.
Yes.
Great.
What was I going to say? So as I said before, you know, we're going to be coming. You know, it never ends. We'll be starting the process for the 2018 competition. Stay tuned. We need your input. This is going to be a huge year for coordinated entry. We really need, you know, everybody to pull together to make that work. It is a real departure, and it really requires everybody to collaborate to have that happen. That said, thank you so much for visiting today, spending this day together. It's my pleasure to be here. And I hope you get to see you again in the near future. Thanks.